Essay on Sir Thomas Browne. English prose literature towards the end of the 17th century, in the hands of Dryden and Locke, was becoming, as that of France had become at an earlier date, a matter of design and skilled practice, highly conscious of itself as an art, and, above all, correct. Up to that time it had been, on the whole, singularly informal and unprofessional, and by no means the literature of the man of letters, as we understand him. Certain great instances there had been of literary structure or architecture, the ecclesiastical polity, the Leviathan, but for the most part that earlier prose literature is eminently occasional, closely determined by the eager practical aims of contemporary politics and theology, or else due to a man's own native instinct to speak because he cannot help speaking. Hardly aware of the habit, he likes talking to himself, and when he writes, still in undress, he does but take the friendly reader into his confidence. The type of this literature, obviously, is not Locke or Gibbon, but, above all others, Sir Thomas Browne, as Jean Paul is a good instance of it in German literature, always in its development so much later than the English, and as the best instance of it in French literature, in the century preceding Browne, is Montaigne, from whom indeed, in a great measure, all those tentative writers, or essayists, derive. It was a result, perhaps, of the individualism and liberty of personal development, which, even for a Roman Catholic, were effects of the Reformation, that there was so much in Montaigne of the subjective, as people say, of the singularities of personal character. Browne, too, bookish as he really is, claims to give his readers a matter, not picked from the leaves of any author, but bred amongst the weeds and tares of his own brain. The faults of such literature are what we all recognize in it: unevenness, alike in thought and style, lack of design, and caprice, the lack of authority, after the full play of which, there is so much to refresh one in the reasonable transparency of Hooker, representing thus early the tradition of a classical clearness in English literature, anticipated by Latimer and Moore, and to be fulfilled afterwards in Butler and Hume. But then, in recompense for that looseness and whim, in Sir Thomas Browne for instance, we have in those quaint writers, as they themselves understood the term, quaint, adorned, but adorned with all the curious ornaments of their own predilection, provincial or archaic, certainly unfamiliar, and selected without reference to the taste or usages of other people, the charm of an absolute sincerity, with all the ingenuous and racy effect of what is circumstantial and peculiar in their growth. The whole creation is a mystery, and particularly that of man. At the blast of his mouth were the rest of the creatures made, and at his bare word they started out of nothing. But in the frame of man he played the sensible operator, and seemed not so much to create as to make him. When he had separated the materials of other creatures, there consequently resulted a form and soul, but having raised the walls of man, he was driven to a second and harder creation, of a substance like himself, an incorruptible and immortal soul. There, we have the manner of Sir Thomas Browne, in exact expression of his mind, minute and curious in its thinking, but with an effect, on the sudden, of a real sublimity or depth. His style is certainly an unequal one. It has the monumental aim which charmed, and perhaps influenced, Johnson, a dignity that can be attained only in such mental calm as follows long and learned pondering on the high subjects Browne loves to deal with. It has its garrulity, its various levels of painstaking, its mannerism, pleasant of its kind or tolerable, together with much, to us intolerable, but of which he was capable on a lazy summer afternoon down at Norwich. And all is so oddly mixed, showing, in its entire ignorance of self, how much he, and the sort of literature he represents, really stood in need of technique, of a formed taste in literature, of a literary architecture. And yet perhaps we could hardly wish the result different, in him, any more than in the books of Burton and Fuller, or some other similar writers of that age. Mental abodes, we might liken, after their own manner, to the little old private houses of some historic town grouped about its grand public structures, which, when they have survived at all, posterity is loath to part with. For, in their absolute sincerity, not only do these authors clearly exhibit themselves, the unique peculiarity of the writer's mind, being, as Johnson says of Browne, faithfully reflected in the form and matter of his work, but, even more than mere professionally instructed writers, they belong to, and reflect, the age they lived in. In essentials, of course, even Browne is by no means so unique among his contemporaries, and so singular, as he looks. And then, as the very condition of their work, there is an entire absence of personal restraint in dealing with the public, whose humors they come at last in a great measure to reproduce. To speak more properly, they have no sense of a public to deal with, at all, only a full confidence in the friendly reader, as they love to call him. Hence their amazing pleasantry, their indulgence in their own conceits, but hence also those unpremeditated wildflowers of speech we should never have the good luck to find in any more formal kind of literature. It is, in truth, to the literary purpose of the humorist, in the old-fashioned sense of the term, that this method of writing naturally allies itself, of the humorist to whom all the world is but a spectacle in which nothing is really alien from himself, who has hardly a sense of the distinction between great and little among things that are at all, and whose half-pitying, half-amused sympathy is called out especially by the seemingly small interests and traits of character in the things or the people around him. Certainly, in an age stirred by great causes, like the age of Browne in England, of Montaigne in France, that is not a type to which one would wish to reduce all men of letters. Still, in an age apt also to become severe, or even cruel, its eager interest in those great causes turning sour on occasion, the character of the humorist may well find its proper influence, through that serene power, and the leisure it has for conceiving second thoughts, on the tendencies, conscious or unconscious, of the fierce wills around it. Something of such a humorist was Browne, not callous to men and their fortunes, certainly not without opinions of his own about them, and yet, undisturbed by the Civil War, by the fall, and then the restoration, of the monarchy, through that long quiet life, ending at last on the day himself had predicted, as if at the moment he had willed, in which all existence, as he says, had been but food for contemplation. Johnson, in beginning his life of Browne, remarks that Browne seems to have had the fortune, common among men of letters, of raising little curiosity after their private life. Whether or not, with the example of Johnson himself before us, we can think just that, it is certain that Browne's works are of a kind to directly stimulate curiosity about himself, as being manifestly so large a part of those works, and as a matter of fact we know a great deal about his life, uneventful as in truth it was. To himself, indeed, his life at Norwich, as he gives us to understand, seemed wonderful enough. Of these wonders, says Johnson, the view that can now be taken of his life offers no appearance. But we carry with us, as Browne writes, the wonders we seek without us, and we may note on the other hand, a circumstance which his daughter, Mrs. Littleton, tells us of his childhood. His father used to open his breast when he was asleep, and kiss it in prayers over him, as 'tis said of Origen's father, that the Holy Ghost would take possession there. It was perhaps because the son inherited an aptitude for a like profound kindling of sentiment in the taking of his life, that, uneventful as it was, commonplace as it seemed to Johnson, to Browne himself it was so full of wonders, and so stimulates the curiosity of his more careful reader of today. What influence, says Johnson again, learning has had on its possessors may be doubtful. Well, the influence of his great learning, of his constant research on Browne, was its imaginative influence, that it completed his outfit as a poetic visionary, stirring all the strange conceit of his nature to its depths. Browne himself dwells, in connection with the first publication, extorted by circumstance, of the Religio Medici, on the natural inactivity of his disposition, and he does, as I have said, pass very quietly through an exciting time. Born in the year of the Gunpowder Plot, he was not, in truth, one of those clear and clarifying souls which, in an age alike of practical and mental confusion, can anticipate and lay down the bases of reconstruction, like Bacon or Hooker. His mind has much of the perplexity which was part of the atmosphere of the time. Not that he is without his own definite opinions on events. For him, Cromwell is a usurper, the death of Charles an abominable murder. In spite of what is but an affectation, perhaps, of the skeptical mood, he is a churchman too, one of those who entered fully into the Anglican position, so full of sympathy with those ceremonies and observances which misguided zeal terms superstition, that there were some Roman Catholics who thought that nothing but custom and education kept him from their communion. At the Restoration he rejoices to see the return of the comely Anglican order in old Episcopal Norwich, with its ancient churches, the antiquity, in particular, of the English Church being, characteristically, one of the things he most valued in it, vindicating it, when occasion came, against the unjust scandal of those who made that church a creation of Henry VIII. As to Romanists, he makes no scruple to enter their churches in defect of ours. He cannot laugh at, but rather pities, the fruitless journeys of pilgrims, for there is something in it of devotion. He could never hear the Ave Mary bell without an oraison. At a solemn procession he has wept abundantly. How English, in truth, all this really is. It reminds one how some of the most popular of English writers, in many a half-conscious expression, have witnessed to a susceptibility in the English mind itself, in spite of the Reformation, to what is affecting in religious ceremony. Only, in religion as in politics, Browne had no turn for disputes, was suspicious of them, indeed, knowing, as he says with true acumen, that a man may be in as just possession of truth as of a city, and yet be forced to surrender, even in controversies not necessarily maladroit, an image in which we may trace a little contemporary coloring. The inquiries into vulgar errors appeared in the year, a year which found him very hard on the vulgar. His suspicion, in the abstract, of what Bacon calls idola fori, the idols of the marketplace, takes a special emphasis from the course of events about him, being erroneous in their single numbers, once huddled together, they will be error itself. And yet, congruously with a dreamy sweetness of character we may find expressed in his very features, he seems not greatly concerned at the temporary suppression of the institutions he values so much. He seems to possess some inward Platonic reality of them, church or monarchy, to hold by an idea, quite beyond the reach of Roundhead or unworthy cavalier. In the power of what is inward and inviolable in his religion, he can still take note, in my solitary and retired imagination, nec enim cum porticus aut me lectulus accipit, dicem mihi, I remember I am not alone, and therefore forget not to contemplate him and his attributes who is ever with me. His father, a merchant of London, with some claims to ancient descent, left him early in possession of ample means. Educated at Winchester and Oxford, he visited Ireland, France, and Italy, and in the year, at the age of 28, became Doctor of Medicine at Leiden. 3 years later he established himself as a physician at Norwich for the remainder of his life, having married a lady, described as beautiful and attractive, and affectionate also, as we may judge from her letters and postscripts to those of her husband, in an orthography of a homeliness amazing even for that age. Dorothy Browne bore him 10 children, 6 of whom he survived. Their house at Norwich, even then an old one it would seem, must have grown, through long years of acquisition, into an odd cabinet of antiquities, antiquities properly so called, his old Roman, or Romanist British urns, from Walsingham or Brampton, for instance, and those natural objects which he studied somewhat in the temper of a curiosity hunter or antiquary. In one of the old churchyards of Norwich he makes the first discovery of adipocere, of which grim substance, a portion still remains with him. For his multifarious experiments he must have had his laboratory. The old window stanchions had become magnetic, proving, as he thinks, that iron acquires verticity, from long lying in one position. Once we find him retiling the place. It was then, perhaps, that he made the observation that bricks and tiles also acquire magnetic eliciency, one's whole house, one might fancy, as indeed, he holds the earth itself to be a vast lodestone. The very faults of his literary work, its desultoriness, the time it costs his readers, that slow latinity which Johnson imitated from him, those lengthy leisurely terminations which busy posterity will abbreviate, all breathe of the long quiet of the place. Yet he is by no means indolent. Besides wide book learning, experimental research at home, and indefatigable observation in the open air, he prosecutes the ordinary duties of a physician, contrasting himself indeed with other students, whose quiet and unmolested doors afford no such distractions. To most persons of mind sensitive as his chosen studies would have seemed full of melancholy, turning always, as they did, upon death and decay. It is well, perhaps, that life should be something of a meditation upon death, but to many, certainly, Brown's would have seemed too like a lifelong following of one's own funeral. A museum is seldom a cheerful place, oftenest induces the feeling that nothing could ever have been young, and to Brown the whole world is a museum, all the grace and beauty it has being of a somewhat mortified kind. Only, for him, poetic dream, or philosophic apprehension, it was this which never failed to evoke his wonderful genius for exquisitely impassioned speech, over all those ugly anatomical preparations, as though over miraculous saintly relics, there was the perpetual flicker of a surviving spiritual ardency, one day to reassert itself, stranger far than any fancied idyllic gravelights. When Brown settled at Norwich, being then about 36 years old, he had already completed the Religio Medici, a desultory collection of observations designed for himself only and a few friends, at all events with no purpose of immediate publication. It had been lying by him for 7 years, circulating privately in his own extraordinarily perplexed manuscript, or in manuscript copies, when, in an incorrect printed version from one of those copies, much corrupted by transcription at various hands, appeared anonymously. Brown, decided royalist as he was in spite of seeming indifference, connects this circumstance with the unscrupulous use of the press for political purposes, and especially against the king, at that time. Just here a romantic figure comes on the scene. Son of the unfortunate young Everard Digby who perished on the scaffold for some half-hearted participation in the Gunpowder Plot, Kenelm Digby, brought up in the Reformed religion, had returned in manhood to the religion of his father. In his intellectual composition he had, in common with Brown, a scientific interest, oddly tinged with both poetry and skepticism. He had also a strong sympathy with religious reaction, and a more than sentimental love for a seemingly vanishing age of faith, which he, for one, would not think of as vanishing. A copy of that surreptitious edition of the Religio Medici found him a prisoner on suspicion of a too active royalism, and with much time on his hands. The Roman Catholic, although secure in his definite orthodoxy, he finds himself indifferent on many points, on the reality of witchcraft, for instance, concerning which Brown's more timid, personally grounded faith might indulge no skepticism, forced himself, nevertheless, to detect a vein of rationalism in a book which on the whole much attracted him, and hastily put forth his animadversions upon it. Brown, with all his distaste for controversy, thus found himself committed to a dispute, and his reply came with the correct edition of the Religio Medici published at last with his name. There have been many efforts to formulate the religion of the layman, which might be rightly understood, perhaps, as something more than what is called natural, yet less than ecclesiastical, or professional, religion. Though its habitual mode of conceiving experience is on a different plane, yet it would recognize the legitimacy of the traditional religious interpretation of that experience, generally and by implication, only, with a marked reserve as to religious particulars, both of thought and language, out of a real reverence or awe, as proper only for a special place. Such is the lay religion, as we may find it in Addison, in Gray, in Thackeray, and there is something of a concession, on second thoughts, about it. Brown's Religio Medici is designed as the expression of a mind more difficult of belief than that of the mere layman, as above described. It is meant for the religion of the man of science. Actually, it is something less to the point, in any balancing of the religious against the worldly view of things, than the religion of the layman, as just now defined. For Brown, in spite of his profession of boisterous doubt, has no real difficulties, and his religion, certainly, nothing of the character of a concession. He holds that there has never existed an atheist. Not that he is credulous, but that his religion is only the correlative of himself, his peculiar character and education, a religion of manifold association. For him, the wonders of religion, its supernatural events or agencies, are almost natural facts or processes. Even in this material fabric, the spirits walk as freely exempt from the affection of time, place and motion, as beyond the extremest circumference. Had not divine interference designed to raise the dead, nature herself is in act to do it, to lead out the incinerated soul from the retreats of her dark laboratory. Certainly Brown has not, like Pascal, made the great resolution, by the apprehension that it is just in the contrast of the moral world to the world with which science deals that religion finds its proper basis. It is from the homelessness of the world which science analyses so victoriously, its dark unspirituality, wherein the soul he is conscious of seems such a stranger, that Pascal turns again to his rest, in the conception of a world of wholly reasonable and moral agencies. For Brown, on the contrary, the light is full, design everywhere obvious, its conclusion easy to draw, all small and great things marked clearly with the signature of the Word. The adhesion, the difficult adhesion, of men such as Pascal, is an immense contribution to religious controversy, the concession, again, of a man like Addison, of great significance there. But in the adhesion of Brown, in spite of his crusade against vulgar errors, there is no real significance. The Religio Medici is a contribution, not to faith, but to piety, a refinement and correction, such as piety often stands in need of, a help, not so much to religious belief in a world of doubt, as to the maintenance of the religious mood amid the interests of a secular calling. From about this time Brown's letters afford a pretty clear view of his life as it passed in the house at Norwich. Many of these letters represent him in correspondence with the singular men who shared his own half-poetic, half-scientific turn of mind, with that impressibility towards what one might call the thaumaturgic elements in nature which has often made men dupes, and which is certainly an element in the somewhat atrabiliar mental complexion of that age in England. He corresponds seriously with William Lilly, the astrologer, is acquainted with Dr. Dee, who had some connection with Norwich and has often heard him affirm, sometimes with oaths, that he had seen transmutation of pewter dishes and flagons into silver, at least, which the goldsmiths at Prague bought of him. Brown is certainly an honest investigator, but it is still with a faint hope of something like that upon fitting occasion, and on the alert always for surprises in nature, as if nature had a rhetoric, at times, to deliver to us, like those sudden and surprising flowers of his own poetic style, that he listens to her everyday talk so attentively. Of strange animals, strange cures, and the like, his correspondence is full. The very errors he combats are, of course, the curiosities of error, those fascinating, irresistible, popular errors, which various kinds of people have insisted on gliding into because they like them. Even his heresies were old ones, the very fossils of capricious opinion. It is as an industrious local naturalist that Brown comes before us first, full of the fantastic minute life in the fens and broads around Norwich, its various sea and marsh birds. He is something of a vivisectionist also, and we may not be surprised at it, perhaps, in an age which, for the propagation of truth, was ready to cut off men's ears. He finds one day a Scarabus capricornus odoratus, which he takes to be mentioned by Monfetus, folio. He saith, Nusum moscatam eti cinnamomum vir spirit, but to me it smelt like roses, santalum, and ambergris. Musca tuliparum muscata, again, is a small bee-like fly of an excellent fragrant odor, which I have often found at the bottom of the flowers of tulips. Is this within the experience of modern entomologists? The Garden of Cyrus, though it ends indeed with a passage of wonderful felicity, certainly emphasizes, to say the least, the defects of Brown's literary good qualities. His chimeric fancy carries him here into a kind of frivolousness, as if he felt almost too safe with his public, and were himself not quite serious, or dealing fairly with it, and in a writer such as Brown levity must of necessity be a little ponderous. Still, like one of those stiff gardens, halfway between the medieval garden and the true English garden of Temple or Walpole, actually to be seen in the background of some of the conventional portraits of that day, the fantasies of this indescribable exposition of the mysteries of the quincunx form part of the complete portrait of Brown himself, and it is in connection with it that, once or twice, the quaintly delightful pen of Evelyn comes into the correspondence, in connection with the Hortulane pleasure. Norwich, he writes to Brown, is a place, I understand, much addicted to the flowery part. Professing himself a believer in the operation of the air and genius of gardens upon human spirits, towards virtue and sanctity, he is all for natural gardens as against those which appear like gardens of pasteboard and marchpane, and smell more of paint than of flowers and verdure. Brown is in communication also with Ashmole and Dugdale, the famous antiquaries, to the latter of whom, who had written a work on the history of the embanking of fens, he communicates the discovery of certain coins, on a piece of ground, in the nature of an island in the fens. Far more interesting certainly than those curious scientific letters is Brown's domestic correspondence. Dobson, Charles I's English Tintoret, would seem to have painted a life-sized picture of Sir Thomas Browne and his family, after the manner of those big, urbane, family groups, then coming into fashion with the Dutch masters. Of such a portrait nothing is now known. But in these old-fashioned, affectionate letters, transmitted often, in those troublous times, with so much difficulty, we have what is almost as graphic, a numerous group, in which, although so many of Browne's children died young, he was happy, with Dorothy Browne, occasionally adding her charming, ill-spelt postscripts to her husband's letters, the religious daughter who goes to daily prayers after the Restoration, which brought Browne the honor of knighthood, and, above all, 2 Toms, son and grandson of Sir Thomas, the latter being the son of Dr. Edward Browne, now become distinguished as a physician in London. He attended John, Earl of Rochester, in his last illness at Woodstock, and his childish existence as he lives away from his proper home in London, in the old house at Norwich, 200 years ago, we see like a thing of today. At first the 2 brothers, Edward and Thomas, the elder, are together in everything. Then Edward goes abroad for his studies, and Thomas, quite early, into the navy, where he certainly develops into a wonderfully gallant figure, passing away, however, from the correspondence, it is uncertain how, before he was of full age. From the first he is understood to be a lad of parts. If you practice to write, you will have a good pen and style and a delightful, boyish journal of his remains, describing a tour the 2 brothers made in September among the Derbyshire hills. I received your 2 last letters, he writes to his father from aboard the Marie Rose, and give you many thanks for the discourse you sent me out of Vossius, de motu Mariam et ventorum. It seemed very hard to me at first, but I have now beaten it, and I wish I had the book. His father is pleased to think that he is like to proceed not only a good navigator, but a good scholar, and he finds the much exacting, old classical prescription for the character of the brave man fulfilled in him. On July the young man writes, still from the Marie Rose. If it were possible to get an opportunity to send as often as I am desirous to write, you should hear more often from me, being now so near the grand action, from which I would by no means be absent. I extremely long for that thundering day, wherein I hope you shall hear we have behaved ourselves like men, and to the honor of our country. I thank you for your directions for my ears against the noise of the guns, but I have found that I could endure it, nor is it so intolerable as most conceive, especially when men are earnest, and intent upon their business, unto whom muskets sound but like popguns. It is impossible to express unto another how a smart sea fight elevates the spirits of a man, and makes him despise all dangers. In and after all sea fights, I have been very thirsty. He died, as I said, early in life. We only hear of him later in connection with a trait of character observed in Tom the grandson, whose winning ways, and tricks of bodily and mental growth, are duly recorded in these letters. The reader will, I hope, pardon the following extracts from them. Little Tom is lively. Frank is fain sometimes to play him asleep with a fiddle. When we send away our letters he scribbles a paper and will have it sent to his sister, and saith she doth not know how many fine things there are in Norwich. He delights his grandfather when he comes home. Tom gives you many thanks for his clothes, from London. He has appeared very fine this King's Day with them. Tom presents his duty. A gentleman at our election asked Tom who he was for. And he answered, for all 4. The gentleman replied that he answered like a physician's son. Tom would have his grandmother, his Aunt Betty, and Frank, Valentines, but he conditioned with them that they should give him nothing of any kind that he had ever had or seen before. Tom is just now gone to see 2 bears which are to be shown. Tom, his duty. He is begging books and reading of them. The players are at the Red Lion hard by, and Tom goes sometimes to see a play. And then one day he stirs old memories. The Farings were welcome to Tom. He finds about the house divers things that were your brother's, the late Edward's, and Betty sometimes tells him stories about him, so that he was importunate with her to write his life in a quarter of a sheet of paper, and read it unto him, and will have still more added. Just as I am writing, learnedly about a comet, January Tom comes and tells me the blazing star is in the yard, and calls me to see it. It was but dim, and the sky not clear. I am very sensible of this sharp weather. He seems to have come to no good end, riding forth one stormy night. Requiescat in pace. Of this long, leisurely existence the chief events were Brown's rare literary publications, some of his writings indeed having been left unprinted till after his death, while in the circumstances of the issue of every one of them there is something accidental, as if the world might have missed it altogether. Even the Discourse of Vulgar Errors, the longest and most elaborate of his works, is entirely discursive and occasional, coming to an end with no natural conclusion, but only because the writer chose to leave off just there, and few probably have been the readers of the book as a consecutive whole. At times indeed we seem to have in it observations only, or notes, preliminary to some more orderly composition. Dip into it, read, for instance, the chapter of the ring finger, or the chapters of the long life of the deer, and on the pictures of mermaids, unicorns, and some others, and the part will certainly seem more than the whole. Try to read it through, and you will soon feel cloyed, miss very likely, its real worth to the fancy, the literary fancy, which finds its pleasure in inventive word and phrase, and become dull to the really vivid beauties of a book so lengthy, but with no real evolution. Though there are words, phrases, constructions innumerable, which remind one how much the work initiated in France by Madame de Rambouillet, work, done for England, we may think perhaps imperfectly, in the next century by Johnson and others, was really needed, yet the capacities of Brown's manner of writing, coming as it did so directly from the man, are felt even in his treatment of matters of science. As with Buffon, his full, ardent, sympathetic vocabulary, the poetry of his language, a poetry inherent in its elementary particles, the word, the epithet, helps to keep his eye, and the eye of the reader, on the object before it and conduces directly to the purpose of the naturalist, the observer. But, only one half observation, its other half consisting of very out-of-the-way book lore, this work displays Brown still in the character of the antiquary, as that age understood him. He is a kind of Elias Ashmole, but dealing with natural objects, which are for him, in the first place, and apart from the remote religious hints and intimations they carry with them, curiosities. He seems to have no true sense of natural law, as Bacon understood it, nor even of that immanent reason in the natural world, which the Platonic tradition supposes. Things are really true, he says, as they correspond unto God's conception, and have so much verity as they hold of conformity unto that intellect, in whose idea they had their first determinations. But, actually, what he is busy in the record of, are matters more or less of the nature of caprices, as if things, after all, were significant of their higher verity only at random, and in a sort of surprises, like music in old instruments suddenly touched into sound by a wandering finger, among the lumber of people's houses. Nature, the art of God, as he says, varying a little a phrase used also by Hobbes, in a work printed later, nature, he seems to protest, is only a little less magical, its processes only a little less in the way of alchemy, than you had supposed. We feel that, as with that disturbed age in England generally, and it is here that he, with it, is so interesting, curious, old world, and unlike ourselves, his supposed experience might at any moment be broken in upon by 100 forms of a natural magic, only not quite so marvelous as that older sort of magic, or alchemy, he is at so much pains to expose, and the large promises of which, its large words too, he still regretfully enjoys. And yet the Discourse of Vulgar Errors, seeming, as it often does, to be a serious refutation of fairy tales, arguing, for instance, against the literal truth of the poetic statement that the pigeon hath no gall, and such questions as whether men weigh heavier dead than alive, being characteristic questions, is designed, with much ambition, under its pedantic Greek title Pseudodoxia Epidemica, as a criticism, a cathartic, an instrument for the clarifying of the intellect. He begins from that first error in paradise, wondering much at man's deceivability in his perfection, at such gross deceit. He enters in this connection, with a kind of poetry of scholasticism which may interest the student of Paradise Lost, into what we may call the intellectual and moral byplay of the situation of the first man and woman in paradise, with strange queries about it. Did Adam, for instance, already know of the fall of the angels? Did he really believe in death, till Abel died? It is from Julius Scaliger that he takes his motto, to the effect that the true knowledge of things must be had from things themselves, not from books, and he seems as seriously concerned as Bacon to dissipate the crude impressions of a false common sense, a false science, and a fictitious authority. Inverting, oddly, Plato's theory that all learning is but reminiscence, he reflects with a sigh how much of oblivion must needs be involved in the getting of any true knowledge. Men that adore times past, consider not that those times were once present, that is, as our own are, and ourselves unto those to come, as they unto us at present. That, surely, coming from one both by temperament and habit so great an antiquary, has the touch of something like an influence in the atmosphere of the time. That there was any actual connection between Brown's work and Bacon's is but a surmise. Yet we almost seem to hear Bacon when Brown discourses on the use of doubts, and the advantages which might be derived from drawing up a calendar of doubts, falsehoods, and popular errors, and, as from Bacon, one gets the impression that men really have been very much the prisoners of their own crude or pedantic terms, notions, associations, that they have been very indolent in testing very simple matters, with a wonderful kind of supinity, as he calls it. In Brown's chapter on the sources of error, again, we may trace much resemblance to Bacon's striking doctrine of the idola, that shams men fall down and worship. Taking source respectively, from the common infirmity of human nature, from the erroneous disposition of the people, from confident adherence to authority, the errors which Brown chooses to deal with may be registered as identical with Bacon's idola tribus, fori, theatri, the idols of our common human nature, of the vulgar, when they get together, and of the learned, when they get together. But of the fourth species of error noted by Bacon, the idola specus, the idols of the cave, that whole tribe of illusions, which are bred amongst the weeds and tares of one's own brain, Brown tells us nothing by way of criticism, was himself, rather, a lively example of their operation. Throw those illusions, those idols, into concrete or personal form, suppose them introduced among the other forces of an active intellect, and you have Sir Thomas Browne himself. The skeptical inquirer who rises from his cathartic, his purging of error, a believer in the supernatural character of pagan oracles, and a cruel judge of supposed witches, must still need as much as ever that elementary conception of the right method and the just limitations of knowledge, by power of which he should not just strain out a single error here or there, but make a final precipitate of fallacy. And yet if the temperament had been deducted from Brown's work, that inherent and strongly marked way of deciding things, which has guided with so surprising effect the musings of the letter to a friend, and the urn burial, we should probably have remembered him little. Pity. Some may think, for himself at least, that he had not lived earlier, and still believed in the mandrake, for instance, its fondness for places of execution, and its human cries, on eradication, with hazard of life to them that pull it up. In philosophy, he observes, meaning to contrast his free thinking in that department with his orthodoxy in religion, in philosophy, where truth seems double-faced, there is no man more paradoxical than myself, which is true, we may think, in a further sense than he meant, and that it was the paradoxical, that he actually preferred. Happy, at all events, he still remained, undisturbed and happy, in 100 native prepossessions, some certainly valueless, some of them perhaps invaluable. And while one feels that no real logic of fallacies has been achieved by him, one feels still more how little the construction of that branch of logical inquiry really helps men's minds, fallacy, like truth itself, being a matter so dependent on innate gift of apprehension, so extra-logical and personal, the original perception counting for almost everything, the mere inference for so little. Yes. A man may be in as just possession of truth as of a city, and yet be forced to surrender, even in controversies not necessarily maladroit. The really stirring poetry of science is not in guesses, or facile divinations about it, but in its larger ascertained truths, the order of infinite space, the slow method and vast results of infinite time. For Brown, however, the sense of poetry which so overmasters his scientific procedure, depends chiefly on its vaguer possibilities, the empirical philosophy, even after Bacon, being still dominated by a temper, resultant from the general unsettlement of men's minds at the Reformation, which may be summed up in the famous question of Montaigne, Qu'est-ce que j'ai? The cold-blooded method of observation and experiment was creeping but slowly over the domain of science, and such unreclaimed portions of it as the phenomena of magnetism had an immense fascination for men like Brown and Digby. Here, in those parts of natural philosophy, but yet in discovery, the America and untravelled parts of truth, lay for them the true prospect of science, like the New World itself to a geographical discoverer such as Raleigh. And welcome as one of the minute hints of that country far ahead of them, the strange bird, or floating fragment of unfamiliar vegetation, which met those early navigators, there was a certain fantastic experiment, in which, as was alleged, Paracelsus had been lucky. For Brown and others it became the crucial type of the kind of agency in nature which, as they conceived, it was the proper function of science to reveal in larger operation. The subject of my last letter, says Dr. Henry Power, then a student, writing to Brown in, the last year of Charles I, being so high and noble a piece of chemistry, invites me once more to request an experimental eviction of it from yourself, and I hope you will not chide my importunity in this petition, or be angry at my so frequent knockings at your door to obtain a grant of so great and admirable a mystery. What the enthusiastic young student expected from Brown, so high and noble a piece of chemistry, was the re-individualing of an incinerated plant, a violet, turning to freshness, and smelling sweet again, out of its ashes, under some genially fitted conditions of the chemic art. Palingenesis, resurrection, effected by orderly prescription, the re-individualing of an incinerated organism, is a subject which affords us a natural transition to the little book of the Hydriotaphia, or treatise of urn burial, about 50 or 60 pages, which, together with a very singular letter not printed till after Brown's death, is perhaps, after all, the best justification of Brown's literary reputation, as it were his own curiously figured urn, and treasure place of immortal memory. In its first presentation to the public this letter was connected with Brown's Christian morals, but its proper and sympathetic collocation would be rather with the urn burial, of which it is a kind of prelude, or strikes the keynote. He is writing in a very complex situation, to a friend, upon occasion of the death of a common friend. The deceased apparently had been little known to Brown himself till his recent visits, while the intimate friend to whom he is writing had been absent at the time, and the leading motive of Brown's letter is the deep impression he has received during those visits, of a sort of physical beauty in the coming of death, with which he still surprises and moves his reader. There had been, in this case, a tardiness and reluctancy in the circumstances of dissolution, which had permitted him, in the character of a physician, as it were to assist at the spiritualizing of the bodily frame by natural process, a wonderful new type of a kind of mortified grace being evolved by the way. The spiritual body had anticipated the formal moment of death, the alert soul, in that tardy decay, changing its vesture gradually, and as if piece by piece. The infinite future had invaded this life perceptibly to the senses, like the ocean felt far inland up a tidal river. Nowhere, perhaps, is the attitude of questioning awe on the threshold of another life displayed with the expressiveness of this unique morsel of literature, though there is something of the same kind, in another than the literary medium, in the delicate monumental sculpture of the early Tuscan school, as also in many of the designs of William Blake, often, though unconsciously, much in sympathy with those unsophisticated Italian workmen. With him, as with them, and with the writer of the letter to a friend upon the occasion of the death of his intimate friend, so strangely. The visible function of death is but to refine, to detach from aught that is vulgar. And this elfin letter, really an impromptu epistle to a friend, affords the best possible light on the general temper of the man who could be moved by the accidental discovery of those old urns at Walsingham, funeral relics of Romans, or Britons Romanist which had learned Roman customs, to the composition of that wonderful book the Hydriotaphia. He had drawn up a short account of the circumstance at the moment, but it was after 10 years brooding that he put forth the finished treatise, dedicated to an eminent collector of ancient coins and other rarities, with congratulations that he can daily command the view of so many imperial faces, and, by way of frontispiece, with one of the urns, drawn with a coal taken out of it and found among the burnt bones. The discovery had resuscitated for him a whole world of latent observation, from life, from out-of-the-way reading, from the natural world, and fused into a composition, which with all its quaintness we may well pronounce classical, all the heterogeneous elements of that singular mind. The desire to record these risen ashes and not to let them be buried twice among us, had set free, in his manner of conceiving things, something not wholly analyzable, something that may be properly called genius, which shapes his use of common words to stronger and deeper senses, in a way unusual in prose writing. Let the reader, for instance, trace his peculiarly sensitive use of the epithets thin and dark, both here and in the letter to a friend. Upon what a grand note he can begin and end chapter or paragraph. When the funeral pyre was out, and the last valediction over, and a large part of the earth is still in the urn unto us. Dealing with a very vague range of feelings, it is his skill to associate them to very definite objects. Like the soul, in Blake's design, exploring the recesses of the tomb, he carries a light, the light of the poetic faith which he cannot put off him, into those dark places, the abode of worms and pismires, peering round with a boundless curiosity in no fear, noting the various casuistical considerations of men's last form of self-love, all those whims of humanity as a student of perpetuity, the mortuary customs of all nations, which, from their very closeness to our human nature, arouse in most minds only a strong feeling of distaste. There is something congruous with the impassive piety of the man in his waiting on accident from without to take start for the work, which, of all his work, is most truly touched by the divine spark. Delightsome as its eloquence is actually found to be, that eloquence is attained out of a certain difficulty and halting crabbedness of expression, the wretched punctuation of the piece being not the only cause of its impressing the reader with the notion that he is but dealing with a collection of notes for a more finished composition, and of a different kind, perhaps a purely erudite treatise on its subject, with detachment of all personal color now adhering to it. Out of an atmosphere of all-pervading oddity and quaintness, the quaintness of mind which reflects that this disclosing of the urns of the ancients hath left unto our view some parts which they never beheld themselves, arises a work really ample and grand, nay, classical, as I said, by virtue of the effectiveness with which it fixes a type in literature, as, indeed, at its best, romantic literature, and Browne is genuinely romantic, in every period attains classical quality, giving true measure of the very limited value of those well-worn critical distinctions. And though the urn burial certainly has much of the character of a poem, yet one is never allowed to forget that it was designed, candidly, as a scientific treatise on one department of ancient culture, as much so as Guichard's curious old French book on divers manners of burial, and was the fruit of much labor, in the way especially of industrious selection from remote and difficult writers, there being then few or no handbooks, or anything like our modern shortcuts to varied knowledge. Quite unaffectedly, a curious learning saturates, with a kind of grey and aged color most apt and congruous with the subject matter, all the thoughts that arise in him. His great store of reading, so freely displayed, he uses almost as poetically as Milton, like him, profiting often by the mere sonorous effect of some heroic or ancient name, which he can adapt to that same sort of learned sweetness of cadence with which so many of his single sentences are made to fall upon the ear. Pope Gregory, that great religious poet, requested by certain eminent persons to send them some of those relics he sought for so devoutly in all the lurking places of old Rome, took up, it is said, a portion of common earth, and delivered it to the messengers, and, on their expressing surprise at such a gift, pressed the earth together in his hand, whereupon the sacred blood of the martyrs was beheld flowing out between his fingers. The veneration of relics became a part of Christian, as some may think it a part of natural, religion. All over Rome we may count how much devotion in fine art is owing to it, and, through all ugliness or superstition, its intention still speaks clearly to serious minds. The poor dead bones, ghastly and forbidding, we know what Shakespeare would have felt about them. Beat not the bones of the buried, when he breathed, he was a man. And it is with something of a similar feeling that Browne is full, on the common and general ground of humanity, an awe-stricken sympathy with those, whose bones lie at the mercies of the living, strong enough to unite all his various chords of feeling into a single strain of impressive and genuine poetry. His real interest is in what may be called the curiosities of our common humanity. As another might be moved at the sight of Alexander's bones, or St. Edmund's, or St. Cecilia's, so he is full of a fine poetical excitement at such lowly relics as the earth hides almost everywhere beneath our feet. But it is hardly fair to take our leave amid these grievous images of so happy a writer as Sir Thomas Browne, so great a lover of the open air, under which much of his life was passed. His work, late one night, draws to a natural close. To keep our eyes open longer, he bethinks himself suddenly, were but to act our antipodes. The huntsmen are up in America. What a fund of open-air cheerfulness, there! In turning to sleep. Still, even when we are dealing with a writer in whom mere style counts for so much as with Browne, it is impossible to ignore his matter, and it is with religion he is really occupied from first to last, hardly less than Richard Hooker. And his religion, too, after all, was a religion of cheerfulness. He has no great consciousness of evil in things, and is no fighter. His religion, if one may say so, was all profit to him, among other ways, in securing an absolute staidness and placidity of temper, for the intellectual work which was the proper business of his life. His contributions to evidence, in the Religio Medici, for instance, hardly tell, because he writes out a view of a really philosophical criticism. What does tell in him, in this direction, is the witness he brings to men's instinct of survival, the intimations of immortality, as Wordsworth terms them, which were natural with him in surprising force. As was said of Jean Paul, his special subject was the immortality of the soul, with an assurance as personal, as fresh and original, as it was, on the one hand, in those old half-civilized people who had deposited the urns, on the other hand, in the cynical French poet of the 19th century, who did not think, but knew, that his soul was imperishable. He lived in an age in which that philosophy made a great stride which ends with Hume, and his lesson, if we may be pardoned for taking away a lesson from so ethical a writer, is the force of men's temperaments in the management of opinion, their own or that of others, that it is not merely different degrees of bare intellectual power which cause men to approach in different degrees to this or that intellectual program. Could he have foreseen the mature result of that mechanical analysis which Bacon had applied to nature, and Hobbes to the mind of man, there is no reason to think that he would have surrendered his own chosen hypothesis concerning them. He represents, in an age, the intellectual powers of which tend strongly to agnosticism, that class of minds to which the supernatural view of things is still credible. The non-mechanical theory of nature has had its grave adherents since, to the non-mechanical theory of man, that he is in contact with a moral order on a different plane from the mechanical order. Thousands, of the most various types and degrees of intellectual power, always adhere, a fact worth the consideration of all ingenious thinkers, if, as is certainly the case with color, music, number, for instance, there may be whole regions of fact, the recognition of which belongs to one and not to another, which people may possess in various degrees, for the knowledge of which, therefore, one person is dependent upon another, and in relation to which the appropriate means of cognition must lie among the elements of what we call individual temperament, so that what looks like a prejudgment may be really a legitimate apprehension. Men are what they are, and are not wholly at the mercy of formal conclusions from their formally limited premises. Browne passes his whole life in observation and inquiry. He is a genuine investigator, with every opportunity. The mind of the age all around him seems passively yielding to an almost foregone intellectual result, to a philosophy of disillusion. But he thinks all that a prejudice, and not from any want of intellectual power certainly, but from some inward consideration, some afterthought, from the antecedent gravitation of his own general character, or, will you say, from that unprecipitated infusion of fallacy in him, he fails to draw, unlike almost all the rest of the world, the conclusion ready to hand. Essay on Wordsworth. Some English critics at the beginning of the present century had a great deal to say concerning a distinction, of much importance, as they thought, in the true estimate of poetry, between the fancy, and another more powerful faculty, the imagination. This metaphysical distinction, borrowed originally from the writings of German philosophers, and perhaps not always clearly apprehended by those who talked of it, involved a far deeper and more vital distinction, with which indeed all true criticism more or less directly has to do, the distinction, namely, between higher and lower degrees of intensity in the poet's perception of his subject, and in his concentration of himself upon his work. Of those who dwelt upon the metaphysical distinction between the fancy and the imagination, it was Wordsworth who made the most of it, assuming it as the basis for the final classification of his poetical writings, and it is in these writings that the deeper and more vital distinction, which, as I have said, underlies the metaphysical distinction, is most needed, and may best be illustrated. For nowhere is there so perplexed a mixture as in Wordsworth's own poetry, of work touched with intense and individual power, with work of almost no character at all. He has much conventional sentiment, and some of that insincere poetic diction, against which his most serious critical efforts were directed. The reaction in his political ideas, consequent on the excesses of, makes him, at times, a mere declaimer on moral and social topics, and he seems, sometimes, to force an unwilling pen, and write by rule. By making the most of these blemishes it is possible to obscure the true aesthetic value of his work, just as his life also, a life of much quiet delicacy and independence, might easily be placed in a false focus, and made to appear a somewhat tame theme in illustration of the more obvious parochial virtues. And those who wish to understand his influence, and experience his peculiar savor, must bear with patience the presence of an alien element in Wordsworth's work, which never coalesced with what is really delightful in it, nor underwent his special power. Who that values his writings most has not felt the intrusion there, from time to time, of something tedious and prosaic? Of all poets equally great, he would gain most by a skillfully made anthology. Such a selection would show, in truth, not so much what he was, or to himself or others seemed to be, as what, by the more energetic and fertile quality in his writings, he was ever tending to become. And the mixture in his work, as it actually stands, is so perplexed, that one fears to miss the least promising composition even, lest some precious morsel should be lying hidden within, the few perfect lines, the phrase, the single word perhaps, to which he often works up mechanically through a poem, almost the whole of which may be tame enough. He who thought that in all creative work the larger part was given passively, to the recipient mind, who waited so dutifully upon the gift, to whom so large a measure was sometimes given, had his times also of desertion and relapse, and he has permitted the impress of these two to remain in his work. And this duality there, the fitfulness with which the higher qualities manifest themselves in it, gives the effect in his poetry of a power not altogether his own, or under his control, which comes and goes when it will, lifting or lowering a matter, poor in itself, so that that old fancy which made the poet's art an enthusiasm, a form of divine possession, seems almost literally true of him. This constant suggestion of an absolute duality between higher and lower moods, and the work done in them, stimulating one always to look below the surface, makes the reading of Wordsworth an excellent sort of training towards the things of art and poetry. It begets in those, who, coming across him in youth, can bear him at all, a habit of reading between the lines, a faith in the effect of concentration and collectedness of mind in the right appreciation of poetry, an expectation of things, in this order, coming to one by means of a right discipline of the temper as well as of the intellect. He meets us with the promise that he has much, and something very peculiar, to give us, if we will follow a certain difficult way, and seems to have the secret of a special and privileged state of mind. And those who have undergone his influence, and followed this difficult way, are like people who have passed through some initiation, a disciplina arcani, by submitting to which they become able constantly to distinguish in art, speech, feeling, manners, that which is organic, animated, expressive, from that which is only conventional, derivative, inexpressive. But although the necessity of selecting these precious morsels for oneself is an opportunity for the exercise of Wordsworth's peculiar influence, and induces a kind of just criticism and true estimate of it, yet the purely literary product would have been more excellent, had the writer himself purged away that alien element. How perfect would have been the little treasury, shut between the covers of how thin a book! Let us suppose the desired separation made, the electric thread untwined, the golden pieces, great and small, lying apart together. What are the peculiarities of this residue? What special sense does Wordsworth exercise, and what instincts does he satisfy? What are the subjects and the motives which in him excite the imaginative faculty? What are the qualities in things and persons which he values, the impression and sense of which he can convey to others, in an extraordinary way? An intimate consciousness of the expression of natural things, which weighs, listens, penetrates, where the earlier mind passed roughly by, is a large element in the complexion of modern poetry. It has been remarked as a fact in mental history again and again. It reveals itself in many forms, but is strongest and most attractive in what is strongest and most attractive in modern literature. It is exemplified, almost equally, by writers as unlike each other as Senancour and Théophile Gautier, as a singular chapter in the history of the human mind. Its growth might be traced from Rousseau to Chateaubriand, from Chateaubriand to Victor Hugo. It has doubtless some latent connection with those pantheistic theories which locate an intelligent soul in material things, and have largely exercised men's minds in some modern systems of philosophy. It is traceable even in the graver writings of historians. It makes as much difference between ancient and modern landscape art, as there is between the rough masks of an early mosaic and a portrait by Reynolds or Gainsborough. Of this new sense, the writings of Wordsworth are the central and elementary expression. He is more simply and entirely occupied with it than any other poet, though there are fine expressions of precisely the same thing in so different a poet as Shelley. There was in his own character a certain contentment, a sort of inborn religious placidity, seldom found united with a sensibility so mobile as his, which was favorable to the quiet, habitual observation of inanimate, or imperfectly animate, existence. His life of 80 years is divided by no very profoundly felt incidents, its changes are almost wholly inward, and it falls into broad, untroubled, perhaps somewhat monotonous spaces. What it most resembles is the life of one of those early Italian or Flemish painters, who, just because their minds were full of heavenly visions, passed, some of them, the better part of 60 years in quiet, systematic industry. This placid life matured a quite unusual sensibility, really innate in him, to the sights and sounds of the natural world, the flower and its shadow on the stone, the cuckoo and its echo. The poem of Resolution and Independence is a storehouse of such records. For its fullness of imagery it may be compared to Keats's St. Agnes Eve. To read one of his longer pastoral poems for the first time, is like a day spent in a new country. The memory is crowded for a while with its precise and vivid incidents. The pliant harebell swinging in the breeze. On some grey rock. The single sheep and the one blasted tree. And the bleak music from that old stone wall. In the meadows and the lower ground. Was all the sweetness of a common dawn. And that green corn all day is rustling in thine ears. Clear and delicate at once, as he is in the outlining of visible imagery, he is more clear and delicate still, and finely scrupulous, in the noting of sounds, so that he conceives of noble sound as even moulding the human countenance to nobler types, and as something actually profaned, by color, by visible form, or image. He has a power likewise of realizing, and conveying to the consciousness of the reader, abstract and elementary impressions, silence, darkness, absolute motionlessness, or, again, the whole complex sentiment of a particular place, the abstract expression of desolation in the long white road, of peacefulness in a particular folding of the hills. In the airy building of the brain, a special day or hour even, comes to have for him a sort of personal identity, a spirit or angel given to it, by which, for its exceptional insight, or the happy light upon it, it has a presence in one's history, and acts there, as a separate power or accomplishment, and he has celebrated in many of his poems that efficacious spirit, which, as he says, resides in these particular spots of time. It is to such a world, and to a world of congruous meditation thereon, that we see him retiring in his but lately published poem of the Recluse, taking leave, without much count of costs, of the world of business, of action and ambition, as also of all that for the majority of mankind counts as sensuous enjoyment. And so it came about that this sense of a life in natural objects, which in most poetry is but a rhetorical artifice, is with Wordsworth the assertion of what for him is almost literal fact. To him every natural object seemed to possess more or less of a moral or spiritual life, to be capable of a companionship with man, full of expression, of inexplicable affinities and delicacies of intercourse. An emanation, a particular spirit, belonged, not to the moving leaves or water only, but to the distant peak of the hills arising suddenly, by some change of perspective, above the nearer horizon, to the passing space of light across the plain, to the lichened druidic stone even, for a certain weird fellowship in it with the moods of men. It was like a survival, in the peculiar intellectual temperament of a man of letters at the end of the 18th century, of that primitive condition, which some philosophers have traced in the general history of human culture, wherein all outward objects alike, including even the works of men's hands, were believed to be endowed with animation, and the world was full of souls, that mood in which the old Greek gods were first begotten, and which had many strange aftergrowths. In the early ages, this belief, delightful as its effects on poetry often are, was but the result of a crude intelligence. But, in Wordsworth, such power of seeing life, such perception of a soul, in inanimate things, came of an exceptional susceptibility to the impressions of eye and ear, and was, in its essence, a kind of sensuousness. At least, it is only in a temperament exceptionally susceptible on the sensuous side, that this sense of the expressiveness of outward things comes to be so large a part of life. That he awakened a sort of thought in sense, is Shelley's just estimate of this element in Wordsworth's poetry. And it was through nature, thus ennobled by a semblance of passion and thought, that he approached the spectacle of human life. Human life, indeed, is for him, at first, only an additional, accidental grace on an expressive landscape. When he thought of man, it was of man as in the presence and under the influence of these effective natural objects, and linked to them by many associations. The close connection of man with natural objects, the habitual association of his thoughts and feelings with a particular spot of earth, has sometimes seemed to degrade those who are subject to its influence, as if it did but reinforce that physical connection of our nature with the actual lime and clay of the soil, which is always drawing us nearer to our end. But for Wordsworth, these influences tended to the dignity of human nature, because they tended to tranquilize it. By raising nature to the level of human thought he gives it power and expression, he subdues man to the level of nature, and gives him thereby a certain breadth and coolness and solemnity. The leech-gatherer on the moor, the woman, stepping westward, are for him natural objects, almost in the same sense as the aged thorn, or the lichened rock on the heath. In this sense the leader of the Lake School, in spite of an earnest preoccupation with man, his thoughts, his destiny, is the poet of nature. And of nature, after all, in its modesty. The English lake country has, of course, its grandeurs. But the peculiar function of Wordsworth's genius, as carrying in it a power to open out the soul of apparently little or familiar things, would have found its true test had he become the poet of Surrey, say. And the prophet of its life. The glories of Italy and Switzerland, though he did write a little about them, had too potent a material life of their own to serve greatly his poetic purpose. Religious sentiment, consecrating the affections and natural regrets of the human heart, above all, that pitiful awe and care for the perishing human clay, of which relic worship is but the corruption, has always had much to do with localities, with the thoughts which attach themselves to actual scenes and places. Now what is true of it everywhere, is truest of it in those secluded valleys where one generation after another maintains the same abiding place, and it was on this side, that Wordsworth apprehended religion most strongly. Consisting, as it did so much, in the recognition of local sanctities, in the habit of connecting the stones and trees of a particular spot of earth with the great events of life, till the low walls, the green mounds, the half-obliterated epitaphs seemed full of voices, and a sort of natural oracles, the very religion of these people of the Dales appeared but as another link between them and the earth, and was literally a religion of nature. It tranquilized them by bringing them under the placid rule of traditional and narrowly localized observances. Grave livers, they seemed to him, under this aspect, with stately speech, and something of that natural dignity of manners, which underlies the highest courtesy. And, seeing man thus as a part of nature, elevated and solemnist in proportion as his daily life and occupations brought him into companionship with permanent natural objects, his very religion forming new links for him with the narrow limits of the valley, the low vaults of his church, the rough stones of his home, made intense for him now with profound sentiment, Wordsworth was able to appreciate passion in the lowly. He chooses to depict people from humble life, because, being nearer to nature than others, they are on the whole more impassioned, certainly more direct in their expression of passion, than other men. It is for this direct expression of passion, that he values their humble words. In much that he said in exaltation of rural life, he was but pleading indirectly for that sincerity, that perfect fidelity to one's own inward presentations, to the precise features of the picture within, without which any profound poetry is impossible. It was not for their tameness, but for this passionate sincerity, that he chose incidents and situations from common life, related in a selection of language really used by men. He constantly endeavors to bring his language near to the real language of men, however, not on the dead level of their ordinary intercourse, but in select moments of vivid sensation, when this language is winnowed and ennobled by excitement. There are poets who have chosen rural life as their subject, for the sake of its passionless repose, and times when Wordsworth himself extols the mere calm and dispassionate survey of things as the highest aim of poetical culture. But it was not for such passionless calm that he preferred the scenes of pastoral life, and the meditative poet, sheltering himself, as it might seem, from the agitations of the outward world, is in reality only clearing the scene for the great exhibitions of emotion, and what he values most is the almost elementary expression of elementary feelings. And so he has much for those who value highly the concentrated presentment of passion, who appraise men and women by their susceptibility to it, and art and poetry as they afford the spectacle of it. Breaking from time to time into the pensive spectacle of their daily toil, their occupations near to nature, come those great elementary feelings, lifting and solemnizing their language and giving it a natural music. The great, distinguishing passion came to Michael by the sheepfold, to Ruth by the wayside, adding these humble children of the furrow to the true aristocracy of passionate souls. In this respect, Wordsworth's work resembles most that of George Sand, in those of her novels which depict country life. With a penetrative pathos, which puts him in the same rank with the masters of the sentiment of pity in literature, with Meinhold and Victor Hugo, he collects all the traces of vivid excitement which were to be found in that pastoral world, the girl who rung her father's knell, the unborn infant feeling about its mother's heart, the instinctive touches of children, the sorrows of the wild creatures, even, their homesickness, their strange yearnings, the tales of passionate regret that hang by a ruined farm building, a heap of stones, a deserted sheepfold, that gay, false, adventurous, outer world, which breaks in from time to time to bewilder and deflower these quiet homes, not passionate sorrow only, for the overthrow of the soul's beauty, but the loss of, or carelessness for personal beauty even, in those whom men have wronged, their pathetic wanness, the sailor, who, in his heart, was half a shepherd on the stormy seas, the wild woman teaching her child to pray for her betrayer. Incidents like the making of the shepherd's staff, or that of the young boy laying the first stone of the sheepfold, all the pathetic episodes of their humble existence, their longing, their wonder at fortune, their poor pathetic pleasures, like the pleasures of children, won so hardly in the struggle for bare existence, their yearning towards each other, in their darkened houses, or at their early toil. A sort of biblical depth and solemnity hangs over this strange, new, passionate, pastoral world, of which he first raised the image, and the reflection of which some of our best modern fiction has caught from him. He pondered much over the philosophy of his poetry, and reading deeply in the history of his own mind, seems at times to have passed the borders of a world of strange speculations, inconsistent enough, had he cared to note such inconsistencies, with those traditional beliefs, which were otherwise the object of his devout acceptance. Thinking of the high value he set upon customariness, upon all that is habitual, local, rooted in the ground, in matters of religious sentiment, you might sometimes regard him as one tethered down to a world, refined and peaceful indeed, but with no broad outlook, a world protected, but somewhat narrowed, by the influence of received ideas. But he is at times also something very different from this, and something much bolder. A chance expression is overheard and placed in a new connection, the sudden memory of a thing long past occurs to him, a distant object is relieved for a while by a random gleam of light, accidents turning up for a moment what lies below the surface of our immediate experience, and he passes from the humble graves and lowly arches of the little rock-like pile of a Westmoreland church, on bold trains of speculative thought, and comes, from point to point, into strange contact with thoughts which have visited, from time to time, far more venturesome, perhaps errant, spirits. He had pondered deeply, for instance, on those strange reminiscences and forebodings, which seem to make our lives stretch before and behind us, beyond where we can see or touch anything, or trace the lines of connection. Following the soul, backwards and forwards, on these endless ways, his sense of man's dim, potential powers became a pledge to him, indeed, of a future life, but carried him back also to that mysterious notion of an earlier state of existence, the fancy of the Platonists, the old heresy of Origen. It was in this mood that he conceived those oft-reiterated regrets for a half-ideal childhood, when the relics of paradise still clung about the soul, a childhood, as it seemed, full of the fruits of old age, lost for all, in a degree, in the passing away of the youth of the world, lost for each one, over again, in the passing away of actual youth. It is this ideal childhood which he celebrates in his famous ode on the recollections of childhood, and some other poems which may be grouped around it, such as the lines on Tintern Abbey, and something like what he describes was actually truer of himself than he seems to have understood, for his own most delightful poems were really the instinctive productions of earlier life, and most surely for him, the first diviner influence of this world passed away, more and more completely, in his contact with experience. Sometimes as he dwelt upon those moments of profound, imaginative power, in which the outward object appears to take color and expression, a new nature almost, from the prompting of the observant mind, the actual world would, as it were, dissolve and detach itself, flake by flake, and he himself seemed to be the creator, and when he would the destroyer, of the world in which he lived. That old isolating thought of many a brain-sick mystic of ancient and modern times. At other times, again, in those periods of intense susceptibility, in which he appeared to himself as but the passive recipient of external influences, he was attracted by the thought of a spirit of life in outward things, a single, all-pervading mind in them, of which man, and even the poet's imaginative energy, are but moments, that old dream of the anima mundi, the mother of all things and their grave, in which some had desired to lose themselves, and others had become indifferent to the distinctions of good and evil. It would come, sometimes, like the sign of the macrocosm to Faust in his cell, the network of man and nature was seen to be pervaded by a common, universal life, a new, bold thought lifted him above the furrow, above the green turf of the Westmoreland churchyard, to a world altogether different in its vagueness and vastness, and the narrow glen was full of the brooding power of one universal spirit. And so he has something, also, for those who feel the fascination of bold speculative ideas, who are really capable of rising upon them to conditions of poetical thought. He uses them, indeed, always with a very fine apprehension of the limits within which alone philosophical imaginings have any place in true poetry, and using them only for poetical purposes, is not too careful even to make them consistent with each other. To him, theories which for other men bring a world of technical diction, brought perfect form and expression, as in those two lofty books of the Prelude, which describe the decay and the restoration of imagination and taste. Skirting the borders of this world of bewildering heights and depths, he got but the first exciting influence of it, that joyful enthusiasm which great imaginative theories prompt, when the mind first comes to have an understanding of them, and it is not under the influence of these thoughts that his poetry becomes tedious or loses its blitheness. He keeps them, too, always within certain ethical bounds, so that no word of his could offend the simplest of those simple souls which are always the largest portion of mankind. But it is, nevertheless, the contact of these thoughts, the speculative boldness in them, which constitutes, at least for some minds, the secret attraction of much of his best poetry, the sudden passage from lowly thoughts and places to the majestic forms of philosophical imagination, the play of these forms over a world so different, enlarging so strangely the bounds of its humble churchyards, and breaking such a wild light on the graves of christened children. And these moods always brought with them faultless expression. In regard to expression, as with feeling and thought, the duality of the higher and lower moods was absolute. It belonged to the higher, the imaginative mood, and was the pledge of its reality, to bring the appropriate language with it. In him, when the really poetical motive worked at all, it united, with absolute justice, the word and the idea, each, in the imaginative flame, becoming inseparably one with the other, by that fusion of matter and form, which is the characteristic of the highest poetical expression. His words are themselves thought and feeling, not eloquent, or musical words merely, but that sort of creative language which carries the reality of what it depicts, directly, to the consciousness. The music of mere meter performs but a limited, yet a very peculiar and subtly ascertained function, in Wordsworth's poetry. With him, meter is but an additional grace, accessory to that deeper music of words and sounds, that moving power, which they exercise in the nobler prose no less than in formal poetry. It is a sedative to that excitement, an excitement sometimes almost painful, under which the language, alike of poetry and prose, attains a rhythmical power, independent of metrical combination, and dependent rather on some subtle adjustment of the elementary sounds of words themselves to the image or feeling they convey. Yet some of his pieces prompted by a sort of half-playful mysticism, like the Daffodils and the 2 April Mornings, are distinguished by a certain quaint gaiety of meter, and rival by their perfect execution, in this respect, similar pieces among our own Elizabethan, or contemporary French poetry. And those who take up these poems after an interval of months, or years perhaps, may be surprised at finding how well old favorites wear, how their strange, inventive turns of diction or thought still send through them the old feeling of surprise. Those who lived about Wordsworth were all great lovers of the older English literature, and oftentimes there came out in him a noticeable likeness to our earlier poets. He quotes unconsciously, but with new power of meaning, a clause from one of Shakespeare's sonnets, and, as with some other men's most famous work, the Ode on the Recollections of Childhood had its anticipator. He drew something too from the unconscious mysticism of the Old English language itself, drawing out the inward significance of its racy idiom, and the not wholly unconscious poetry of the language used by the simplest people under strong excitement, language, therefore, at its origin. The office of the poet is not that of the moralist, and the first aim of Wordsworth's poetry is to give the reader a peculiar kind of pleasure. But through his poetry, and through this pleasure in it, he does actually convey to the reader an extraordinary wisdom in the things of practice. One lesson, if men must have lessons, he conveys more clearly than all, the supreme importance of contemplation in the conduct of life. Contemplation, impassioned contemplation, that, is with Wordsworth the end in itself, the perfect end. We see the majority of mankind going most often to definite ends, lower or higher ends, as their own instincts may determine, but the end may never be attained, and the means not be quite the right means, great ends and little ones alike being, for the most part, distant, and the ways to them, in this dim world, somewhat vague. Meantime, to higher or lower ends, they move too often with something of a sad countenance, with hurried and ignoble gait, becoming, unconsciously, something like thorns, in their anxiety to bear grapes, it being possible for people, in the pursuit of even great ends, to become themselves thin and impoverished in spirit and temper, thus diminishing the sum of perfection in the world, at its very sources. We understand this when it is a question of mean, or of intensely selfish ends, of grandet, or javert. We think it bad morality to say that the end justifies the means, and we know how false to all higher conceptions of the religious life is the type of one who is ready to do evil that good may come. We contrast with such dark, mistaken eagerness, a type like that of Saint Catherine of Siena, who made the means to her ends so attractive, that she has won for herself an undying place in the house beautiful, not by her rectitude of soul only, but by its fairness, by those quite different qualities which commend themselves to the poet and the artist. Yet, for most of us, the conception of means and ends covers the whole of life, and is the exclusive type or figure under which we represent our lives to ourselves. Such a figure, reducing all things to machinery, though it has on its side the authority of that old Greek moralist who has fixed for succeeding generations the outline of the theory of right living, is too like a mere picture or description of men's lives as we actually find them, to be the basis of the higher ethics. It covers the meanness of men's daily lives, and much of the dexterity with which they pursue what may seem to them the good of themselves or of others, but not the intangible perfection of those whose ideal is rather in being than in doing, not those manners which are, in the deepest as in the simplest sense, morals, and without which one cannot so much as offer a cup of water to a poor man without offence, not the part of antique Rachel, sitting in the company of Beatrice, and even the moralist might well endeavor rather to withdraw men from the too exclusive consideration of means and ends, in life. Against this predominance of machinery in our existence, Wordsworth's poetry, like all great art and poetry, is a continual protest. Justify rather the end by the means, it seems to say, whatever may become of the fruit, make sure of the flowers and the leaves. It was justly said, therefore, by one who had meditated very profoundly on the true relation of means to ends in life, and on the distinction between what is desirable in itself and what is desirable only as machinery, that when the battle which he and his friends were waging had been won, the world would need more than ever those qualities which Wordsworth was keeping alive and nourishing. That the end of life is not action but contemplation, being as distinct from doing, a certain disposition of the mind, is, in some shape or other, the principle of all the higher morality. In poetry, in art, if you enter into their true spirit at all, you touch this principle, in a measure. These, by their very sterility, are a type of beholding for the mere joy of beholding. To treat life in the spirit of art, is to make life a thing in which means and ends are identified, to encourage such treatment, the true moral significance of art and poetry. Wordsworth, and other poets who have been like him in ancient or more recent times, are the masters, the experts, in this art of impassioned contemplation. Their work is, not to teach lessons, or enforce rules, or even to stimulate us to noble ends, but to withdraw the thoughts for a little while from the mere machinery of life, to fix them, with appropriate emotions, on the spectacle of those great facts in man's existence which no machinery affects, on the great and universal passions of men, the most general and interesting of their occupations, and the entire world of nature, on the operations of the elements and the appearances of the visible universe, on storm and sunshine, on the revolutions of the seasons, on cold and heat, on loss of friends and kindred, on injuries and resentments, on gratitude and hope, on fear and sorrow. To witness this spectacle with appropriate emotions is the aim of all culture, and of these emotions poetry like Wordsworth's is a great nourisher and stimulant. He sees nature full of sentiment and excitement, he sees men and women as parts of nature, passionate, excited, in strange grouping in connection with the grandeur and beauty of the natural world, images, in his own words, of man's suffering, amid awful forms and powers. Such is the figure of the more powerful and original poet, hidden away, in part, under those weaker elements in Wordsworth's poetry, which for some minds determine their entire character, a poet somewhat bolder and more passionate than might at first sight be supposed, but not too bold for true poetical taste, an unimpassioned writer, you might sometimes fancy, yet thinking the chief aim, in life and art alike, to be a certain deep emotion, seeking most often the great elementary passions in lowly places, having at least this condition of all impassioned work, that he aims always at an absolute sincerity of feeling and diction, so that he is the true forerunner of the deepest and most passionate poetry of our own day, yet going back also, with something of a protest against the conventional fervor of much of the poetry popular in his own time, to those older English poets, whose unconscious likeness often comes out in him. Essay on Coleridge. Forms of intellectual and spiritual culture sometimes exercise their subtlest and most artful charm when life is already passing from them. Searching and irresistible as are the changes of the human spirit on its way to perfection, there is yet so much elasticity of temper that what must pass away sooner or later is not disengaged all at once, even from the highest order of minds. Nature, which by one law of development evolves ideas, hypotheses, modes of inward life, and represses them in turn, has in this way provided that the earlier growth should propel its fibers into the later, and so transmit the whole of its forces in an unbroken continuity of life. Then comes the spectacle of the reserve of the elder generation exquisitely refined by the antagonism of the new. That current of new life chastens them while they contend against it. Weaker minds fail to perceive the change, the clearest minds abandon themselves to it. To feel the change everywhere, yet not abandon oneself to it, is a situation of difficulty and contention. Communicating, in this way, to the passing stage of culture, the charm of what is chastened, high-strung, athletic, they yet detach the highest minds from the past, by pressing home its difficulties and finally proving it impossible. Such has been the charm of many leaders of lost causes in philosophy and in religion. It is the special charm of Coleridge, in connection with those older methods of philosophic inquiry, over which the empirical philosophy of our day has triumphed. Modern thought is distinguished from ancient by its cultivation of the relative spirit in place of the absolute. Ancient philosophy sought to arrest every object in an eternal outline, to fix thought in a necessary formula, and the varieties of life in a classification by kinds or genera. To the modern spirit nothing is, or can be rightly known, except relatively and under conditions. The philosophical conception of the relative has been developed in modern times through the influence of the sciences of observation. Those sciences reveal types of life evanescing into each other by inexpressible refinements of change. Things pass into their opposites by accumulation of undefinable quantities. The growth of those sciences consists in a continual analysis of facts of rough and general observation into groups of facts more precise and minute. The faculty for truth is recognized as a power of distinguishing and fixing delicate and fugitive detail. The moral world is ever in contact with the physical, and the relative spirit has invaded moral philosophy from the ground of the inductive sciences. There it has started a new analysis of the relations of body and mind, good and evil, freedom and necessity. Hard and abstract moralities are yielding to a more exact estimate of the subtlety and complexity of our life. Always, as an organism increases in perfection, the conditions of its life become more complex. Man is the most complex of the products of nature. Character merges into temperament, the nervous system refines itself into intellect. Man's physical organism is played upon not only by the physical conditions about it, but by remote laws of inheritance, the vibration of long-past acts reaching him in the midst of the new order of things in which he lives. When we have estimated these conditions he is still not yet simple and isolated, for the mind of the race, the character of the age, sway him this way or that through the medium of language and current ideas. It seems as if the most opposite statements about him were alike true, he is so receptive, all the influences of nature and of society ceaselessly playing upon him, so that every hour in his life is unique, changed altogether by a stray word, or glance, or touch. It is the truth of these relations that experience gives us, not the truth of eternal outlines ascertained once for all, but a world of fine gradations and subtly linked conditions, shifting intricately as we ourselves change, and bids us, by a constant clearing of the organs of observation and perfecting of analysis, to make what we can of these. To the intellect, the critical spirit, just these subtleties of effect are more precious than anything else. What is lost in precision of form is gained in intricacy of expression. It is no vague scholastic abstraction that will satisfy the speculative instinct in our modern minds. Who would change the color or curve of a rose leaf for that Ugia achromatos, ascomatistos, anaphis, that colorless, formless, intangible, being, Plato puts so high? For the true illustration of the speculative temper is not the Hindu mystic, lost to sense, understanding, individuality, but one such as Goethe, to whom every moment of life brought its contribution of experimental, individual knowledge, by whom no touch of the world of form, color, and passion was disregarded. Now the literary life of Coleridge was a disinterested struggle against the relative spirit. With a strong native bent towards the tracking of all questions, critical or practical, to first principles, he is ever restlessly scheming to apprehend the absolute, to affirm it effectively, to get it acknowledged. It was an effort, surely, an effort of sickly thought, that saddened his mind, and limited the operation of his unique poetic gift. So what the reader of our own generation will least find in Coleridge's prose writings is the excitement of the literary sense. And yet, in those grey volumes, we have the larger part of the production of one who made way ever by a charm, the charm of voice, of aspect, of language, above all by the intellectual charm of new, moving, luminous ideas. Perhaps the chief offense in Coleridge is an excess of seriousness, a seriousness arising not from any moral principle, but from a misconception of the perfect manner. There is a certain shade of unconcern, the perfect manner of the 18th century, which may be thought to mark complete culture in the handling of abstract questions. The humanist, the possessor of that complete culture, does not weep over the failure of a theory of the quantification of the predicate, nor shriek over the fall of a philosophical formula. A kind of humor is, in truth, one of the conditions of the just mental attitude, in the criticism of bypassed stages of thought. Humanity cannot afford to be too serious about them, any more than a man of good sense can afford to be too serious in looking back upon his own childhood. Plato, whom Coleridge claims as the first of his spiritual ancestors, Plato, as we remember him, a true humanist, holds his theories lightly, glances with a somewhat blithe and naive inconsequence from one view to another, not anticipating the burden of importance views will one day have for men. In reading him one feels how lately it was that Croesus thought it a paradox to say that external prosperity was not necessarily happiness. But on Coleridge lies the whole weight of the sad reflection that has since come into the world, with which for us the air is full, which the children in the marketplace repeat to each other. His very language is forced and broken lest some saving formula should be lost, distinctities, enucleation, pentad of operative Christianity. He has a whole armory of these terms, and expects to turn the tide of human thought by fixing the sense of such expressions as reason, understanding, idea. Again, he lacks the jealousy of a true artist in excluding all associations that have no color, or charm, or gladness in them, and everywhere allows the impress of a somewhat inferior theological literature. I was driven from life in motion to life in thought and sensation, so Coleridge sums up his childhood, with its delicacy, its sensitiveness, and passion. But at 25 he was exercising a wonderful charm, and had already defined for himself his peculiar line of intellectual activity. He had an odd, attractive gift of conversation, or rather of monologue, as Madame de Staël observed of him, full of bizarreries, with the rapid alternations of a dream, and here or there an unexpected summons into a world strange to the hearer, abounding in images drawn from a sort of divided and perfect life, the consciousness of the opium eater, as of one to whom the external world penetrated only in part, and, blent with all this, passages of deep obscurity, precious, if at all, only for their musical cadence, echoes in Coleridge of the eloquence of those older English writers of whom he was so ardent a lover. And all through this brilliant early manhood we may discern the power of the Asiatic temperament, of that voluptuousness, which is connected perhaps with his appreciation of the intimacy, the almost mystical communion of touch, between nature and man. I am much better, he writes, and my new and tender health is all over me like a voluptuous feeling. And whatever fame, or charm, or life-inspiring gift he has had as a speculative thinker, is the vibration of the interest he excited then, the propulsion into years which clouded his early promise of that first buoyant, irresistible, self-assertion. So great is even the indirect power of a sincere effort towards the ideal life, of even a temporary escape of the spirit from routine. He visited Germany, then, the only half-known, promised land, of the metaphysical, the absolute, philosophy. A beautiful fragment of this period remains, describing a spring excursion to the Brocken. His excitement still vibrates in it. Love, all joyful states of mind, are self-expressive, they loosen the tongue, they fill the thoughts with sensuous images, they harmonize one with the world of sight. We hear of the rich graciousness and courtesy of Coleridge's manner, of the white and delicate skin, the abundant black hair, the full, almost animal lips, that whole physiognomy of the dreamer, already touched with narcotism. One says, of the beginning of one of his Unitarian sermons, his voice rose like a stream of rich, distilled perfumes. Another, he talks like an angel, and does nothing. The Aids to Reflection, The Friend, the Biographia Literaria, those books came from one whose vocation was in the world of the imagination, the theory and practice of poetry. And yet, perhaps, of all books that have been influential in modern times, they are furthest from artistic form, bundles of notes, the original matter inseparably mixed up with that borrowed from others, the whole, just that mere preparation for an artistic effect which the finished literary artist would be careful one day to destroy. Here, again, we have a trait profoundly characteristic of Coleridge. He sometimes attempts to reduce a phase of thought, subtle and exquisite, to conditions too rough for it. He uses a purely speculative gift for direct moral edification. Scientific truth is a thing fugitive, relative, full of fine gradations, he tries to fix it in absolute formulas. The Aids to Reflection, The Friend, are efforts to propagate the volatile spirit of conversation into the less ethereal fabric of a written book, and it is only here or there that the poorer matter becomes vibrant, is really lifted by the spirit. De Quincey said of him that he wanted better bread than can be made with wheat, lamb, that from childhood he had hungered for eternity. Yet the faintness, the continuous dissolution, whatever its cause, which soon supplanted the buoyancy of his first wonderful years, had its own consumptive refinements, and even brought, as to the beautiful soul, in Wilhelm Meister, a faint religious ecstasy, that singing in the sails, which is not of the breeze. Here again is one of his occasional notes. In looking at objects of nature while I am thinking, as at yonder moon, dim glimmering through the window pane, I seem rather to be seeking, as it were asking, a symbolical language for something within me, that already and forever exists, than observing anything new. Even when the latter is the case, yet still I have always an obscure feeling, as if that new phenomenon were the dim awaking of a forgotten or hidden truth of my inner nature. While I was preparing the pen to make this remark, I lost the train of thought which had led me to it. What a distemper of the eye of the mind! What an almost bodily distemper there is in that! Coleridge's intellectual sorrows were many, but he had one singular intellectual happiness. With an inborn taste for transcendental philosophy, he lived just at the time when that philosophy took an immense spring in Germany, and connected itself with an impressive literary movement. He had the good luck to light upon it in its freshness, and introduce it to his countrymen. What an opportunity for one reared on the colorless analytic English philosophies of the last century, but who feels an irresistible attraction towards bold metaphysical synthesis. How rare are such occasions of intellectual contentment! This transcendental philosophy, chiefly as systematized by the mystic Schelling, Coleridge applied with an eager, unwearied subtlety, to the questions of theology, and poetic or artistic criticism. It is in his theory of poetry, of art, that he comes nearest to principles of permanent truth and importance, that is the least fugitive part of his prose work. What, then, is the essence of his philosophy of art, of imaginative production? Generally, it may be described as an attempt to reclaim the world of art as a world of fixed laws, to show that the creative activity of genius and the simplest act of thought are but higher and lower products of the laws of a universal logic. Criticism, feeling its own inadequacy in dealing with the greater works of art, is sometimes tempted to make too much of those dark and capricious suggestions of genius, which even the intellect possessed by them is unable to explain or recall. It has seemed due to the half-sacred character of those works to ignore all analogy between the productive process by which they had their birth, and the simpler processes of mind. Coleridge, on the other hand, assumes that the highest phases of thought must be more, not less, than the lower, subject to law. With this interest, in the Biographia Literaria, he refines Schelling's philosophy of nature into a theory of art. There can be no plagiarism in philosophy, says Heine. Es geht kein Plagiat in der Philosophie, in reference to the charge brought against Schelling of unacknowledged borrowing from Bruno, and certainly that which is common to Coleridge and Schelling and Bruno alike is of far earlier origin than any of them. Schellingism, the philosophy of nature, is indeed a constant tradition in the history of thought, it embodies a permanent type of the speculative temper. That mode of conceiving nature as a mirror or reflex of the intelligence of man may be traced up to the first beginnings of Greek speculation. There are two ways of envisaging those aspects of nature which seem to bear the impress of reason or intelligence. There is the deist's way, which regards them merely as marks of design, which separates the informing mind from its result in nature, as the mechanist from the machine, and there is the pantheistic way, which identifies the two, which regards nature itself as the living energy of an intelligence of the same kind as though vaster in scope than the human. Partly through the influence of mythology, the Greek mind became early possessed with the conception of nature as living, thinking, almost speaking to the mind of man. This unfixed poetical prepossession, reduced to an abstract form, petrified into an idea, is the force which gives unity of aim to Greek philosophy. Little by little, it works out the substance of the Hegelian formula: whatever is according to reason, whatever is according to reason, that is. Experience, which has gradually saddened the earth's colors for us, stiffened its motions, withdrawn from it some blithe and debonair presence, has quite changed the character of the science of nature, as we understand it. The positive method, in truth, makes very little account of marks of intelligence in nature. In its wider view of phenomena, it sees that those instances are a minority, and may rank as happy coincidences. It absorbs them in the larger conception of universal mechanical law. But the suspicion of a mind latent in nature, struggling for release, and intercourse with the intellect of man through true ideas, has never ceased to haunt a certain class of minds. Started again and again in successive periods by enthusiasts on the antique pattern, in each case the thought may have seemed paler and more fantastic amid the growing consistency and sharpness of outline of other and more positive forms of knowledge. Still, wherever the speculative instinct has been united with a certain poetic inwardness of temperament, as in Bruno, in Schelling, there that old Greek conception, like some seed floating in the air, has taken root and sprung up anew. Coleridge, thrust inward upon himself, driven from life in thought and sensation to life in thought only, feels already, in his dark London school, a thread of the Greek mind on this matter vibrating strongly in him. At 15 he is discoursing on Plotinus, as in later years he reflects from Schelling that flitting intellectual tradition. He supposes a subtle, sympathetic coordination between the ideas of the human reason and the laws of the natural world. Science, the real knowledge of that natural world, is to be attained, not by observation, experiment, analysis, patient generalization, but by the evolution or recovery of those ideas directly from within, by a sort of Platonic recollection, every group of observed facts remaining an enigma until the appropriate idea is struck upon them from the mind of a Newton, or a Cuvier, the genius in whom sympathy with the universal reason becomes entire. In the next place, he conceives that this reason or intelligence in nature becomes reflective, or self-conscious. He fancies he can trace, through all the simpler forms of life, fragments of an eloquent prophecy about the human mind. The whole of nature he regards as a development of higher forms out of the lower, through shade after shade of systematic change. The dim stir of chemical atoms towards the axis of crystal form, the trance-like life of plants, the animal troubled by strange irritabilities, are stages which anticipate consciousness. All through the ever-increasing movement of life that was shaping itself, every successive phase of life, in its unsatisfied susceptibilities, seeming to be drawn out of its own limits by the more pronounced current of life on its confines, the shadow of approaching humanity, gradually deepening, the latent intelligence winning a way to the surface. And at this point the law of development does not lose itself in caprice, rather it becomes more constraining and incisive. From the lowest to the very highest acts of the conscious intelligence, there is another series of refining shades. Gradually the mind concentrates itself, frees itself from the limitations of the particular, the individual, attains a strange power of modifying and centralizing what it receives from without, according to the pattern of an inward ideal. At last, in imaginative genius, ideas become effective, the intelligence of nature, all its discursive elements now connected and justified, is clearly reflected, the interpretation of its latent purposes being embodied in the great central products of creative art. The secret of creative genius would be an exquisitely purged sympathy with nature, with the reasonable soul antecedent there. Those associative conceptions of the imagination, those eternally fixed types of action and passion, would come, not so much from the conscious invention of the artist, as from his self-surrender to the suggestions of an abstract reason or ideality in things. They would be evolved by the stir of nature itself, realizing the highest reach of its dormant reason. They would have a kind of prevenient necessity to rise at some time to the surface of the human mind. It is natural that Shakespeare should be the favorite illustration of such criticism, whether in England or Germany. The first suggestion in Shakespeare is that of capricious detail, of a waywardness that plays with the parts careless of the impression of the whole. What supervenes is the constraining unity of effect, the ineffaceable impression, of Hamlet or Macbeth. His hand moving freely is curved round as if by some law of gravitation from within, an energetic unity or identity makes itself visible amid an abounding variety. This unity or identity Coleridge exaggerates into something like the identity of a natural organism, and the associative act which affected it into something closely akin to the primitive power of nature itself. In the Shakespearean drama, he says, there is a vitality which grows and evolves itself from within. Again, he, too, worked in the spirit of nature, by evolving the germ from within, by the imaginative power, according to the idea. For as the power of seeing is to light, so is an idea in mind to a law in nature. They are correlatives which suppose each other. Again, the organic form is innate, it shapes, as it develops, itself from within, and the fullness of its development is one and the same with the perfection of its outward form. Such as the life is, such is the form. Nature, the prime, genial artist, inexhaustible in diverse powers, is equally inexhaustible in forms. Each exterior is the physiognomy of the being within, and even such is the appropriate excellence of Shakespeare, himself a nature humanized, a genial understanding, directing self-consciously a power and an implicit wisdom deeper even than our consciousness. In this late age we are become so familiarized with the greater works of art as to be little sensitive of the act of creation in them. They do not impress us as a new presence in the world. Only sometimes, in productions which realize immediately a profound influence and enforce a change in taste, we are actual witnesses of the molding of an unforeseen type by some new principle of association, and to that phenomenon Coleridge wisely recalls our attention. What makes his view a one-sided one is, that in it the artist has become almost a mechanical agent. Instead of the most luminous and self-possessed phase of consciousness, the associative act in art or poetry is made to look like some blindly organic process of assimilation. The work of art is likened to a living organism. That expresses truly the sense of a self-delighting, independent life which the finished work of art gives us. It hardly figures the process by which such work was produced. Here there is no blind ferment of lifeless elements towards the realization of a type. By exquisite analysis the artist attains clearness of idea, then, through many stages of refining, clearness of expression. He moves slowly over his work, calculating the tenderest tone, and restraining the subtlest curve, never letting hand or fancy move at large, gradually enforcing flaccid spaces to the higher degree of expressiveness. The philosophic critic, at least, will value, even in works of imagination, seemingly the most intuitive, the power of the understanding in them, their logical process of construction, the spectacle of a supreme intellectual dexterity which they afford. Coleridge's prose writings on philosophy, politics, religion, and criticism, were, in truth, but one element in a whole lifetime of endeavors to present the then recent metaphysics of Germany to English readers, as a legitimate expansion of the older, classical and native masters of what has been variously called the a priori, or absolute, or spiritual, or Platonic, view of things. His criticism, his challenge for recognition in the concrete, visible, finite work of art, of the dim, unseen, comparatively infinite, soul or power of the artist, may well be remembered as part of the long pleading of German culture for the things behind the veil. To introduce that spiritual philosophy, as represented by the more transcendental parts of Kant, and by Schelling, into all subjects, as a system of reason in them, one and ever identical with itself, however various the matter through which it was diffused, became with him the motive of an unflagging enthusiasm, which seems to have been the one thread of continuity in a life otherwise singularly wanting in unity of purpose, and in which he was certainly far from uniformly at his best. Fragmentary and obscure, but often eloquent, and always at once earnest and ingenious. Those writings, supplementing his remarkable gift of conversation, were directly and indirectly influential, even on some the furthest removed from Coleridge's own masters, on John Stuart Mill, for instance, and some of the earlier writers of the High Church school. Like his verse, they display him also in two other characters, as a student of words, and as a psychologist, that is, as a more minute observer or student than other men of the phenomena of mind. To note the recondite associations of words, old or new, to expound the logic, the reasonable soul, of their various uses, to recover the interest of older writers who had had a phraseology of their own, this was a vein of inquiry allied to his undoubted gift of tracking out and analyzing curious modes of thought. A quaint fragment of verse on human life might serve to illustrate his study of the earlier English philosophical poetry. The latter gift, that power of the subtle-souled psychologist, as Shelley calls him, seems to have been connected with some tendency to disease in the physical temperament, something of a morbid want of balance in those parts where the physical and intellectual elements mix most closely together, with a kind of languid visionariness, deep-seated in the very constitution of the narcotist, who had quite a gift for plucking the poisons of self-harm, and which the actual habit of taking opium, accidentally acquired, did but reinforce. This morbid languor of nature, connected both with his fitfulness of purpose and his rich delicate dreaminess, qualifies Coleridge's poetic composition even more than his prose, his verse, with the exception of his avowedly political poems, being, unlike that of the Lake School, to which in some respects he belongs, singularly unaffected by any moral, or professional, or personal effort or ambition, written, as he says, after the more violent emotions of sorrow, to give him pleasure, when perhaps nothing else could, but coming thus, indeed, very close to his own most intimately personal characteristics, and having a certain languidly soothing grace or cadence, for its most fixed quality, from first to last. After some Platonic soliloquy on a flower opening on a fine day in February, he goes on. Dim similitudes. Weaving in mortal strains, I've stolen 1 hour from anxious self, life's cruel taskmaster. And the warm wooings of this sunny day tremble along my frame and harmonize. The attempered organ, that even saddest thoughts mix with some sweet sensations, like harsh tunes played deftly on a sweet-toned instrument. The expression of two opposed, yet allied, elements of sensibility in these lines, is very true to Coleridge, the grievous agitation, the grievous listlessness, almost never entirely relieved, together with a certain physical voluptuousness. He has spoken several times of the scent of the bean field in the air, the tropical touches in a chilly climate. His is a nature that will make the most of these, which finds a sort of caress in such things. Kubla Khan, the fragment of a poem actually composed in some certainly not quite healthy sleep, is perhaps chiefly of interest as showing, by the mode of its composition, how physical, how much of a diseased or valetudinarian temperament, in its moments of relief, Coleridge's happiest gift really was, and side by side with Kubla Khan should be read, as Coleridge placed it, the pains of sleep, to illustrate that retarding physical burden in his temperament, that unimpassioned grief, the source of which lay so near the source of those pleasures. Connected also with this, and again in contrast with Wordsworth, is the limited quantity of his poetical performance, as he himself regrets so eloquently in the lines addressed to Wordsworth after his recitation of the prelude. It is like some exotic plant, just managing to blossom a little in the somewhat un-English air of Coleridge's own southwestern birthplace, but never quite well there. He joined Wordsworth in the composition of a volume of poems, the Lyrical Ballads. What Wordsworth then wrote already vibrates with that blithe impulse which carried him to final happiness and self-possession. In Coleridge we feel already that faintness and obscure dejection which clung like some contagious damp to all his work. Wordsworth was to be distinguished by a joyful and penetrative conviction of the existence of certain latent affinities between nature and the human mind, which reciprocally gild the mind and nature with a kind of heavenly alchemy. My voice proclaims how exquisitely the individual mind, and the progressive powers, perhaps, no less, of the whole species, to the external world, is fitted, and how exquisitely, 2. The external world is fitted to the mind. And the creation, by no lower name can it be called, which they with blended might accomplish. In Wordsworth this took the form of an unbroken dreaming over the aspects and transitions of nature, a reflective, though altogether unformulated, analysis of them. There are in Coleridge's poems expressions of this conviction as deep as Wordsworth's. But Coleridge could never have abandoned himself to the dream, the vision, as Wordsworth did, because the first condition of such abandonment must be an unvexed quietness of heart. No one can read the lines composed above Tintern without feeling how potent the physical element was among the conditions of Wordsworth's genius, felt in the blood and felt along the heart. My whole life I have lived in quiet thought. The stimulus which most artists require of nature he can renounce. He leaves the ready-made glory of the Swiss mountains that he may reflect glory on a mouldering leaf. He loves best to watch the floating thistledown, because of its hint at an unseen life in the air. Coleridge's temperament, aen sphodorexii, with its faintness, its grieved dejection, could never have been like that. My genial spirits fail. And what can these avail? To lift the smothering weight from off my breast? It were a vain endeavor. Though I should gaze for ever on that green light that lingers in the west, I may not hope from outward forms to win the passion and the life whose fountains are within. Wordsworth's flawless temperament, his fine mountain atmosphere of mind, that calm, sabbatic, mystic, well-being which De Quincey, a little cynically, connected with worldly, that is to say, pecuniary, good fortune, kept his conviction of a latent intelligence in nature within the limits of sentiment or instinct, and confined it to those delicate and subdued shades of expression which alone perfect art allows. In Coleridge's sadder, more purely intellectual, cast of genius, what with Wordsworth was sentiment or instinct became a philosophical idea, or philosophical formula, developed, as much as possible, after the abstract and metaphysical fashion of the transcendental schools of Germany. The period of Coleridge's residence at Nether Stowey, was for him the annus mirabilis. Nearly all the chief works by which his poetic fame will live were then composed or planned. What shapes itself for criticism as the main phenomenon of Coleridge's poetic life, is not, as with most true poets, the gradual development of a poetic gift, determined, enriched, retarded, by the actual circumstances of the poet's life, but the sudden blossoming, through one short season, of such a gift already perfect in its kind, which thereafter deteriorates as suddenly, with something like premature old age. Connecting this phenomenon with the leading motive of his prose writings, we might note it as the deterioration of a productive or creative power into one merely metaphysical or discursive. In his unambitious conception of his function as a poet, and in the very limited quantity of his poetical performance, as I have said, he was a contrast to his friend Wordsworth. That friendship with Wordsworth, the chief, developing, circumstance of his poetic life, comprehended a very close intellectual sympathy, and in such association chiefly, lies whatever truth there may be in the popular classification of Coleridge as a member of what is called the Lake School. Coleridge's philosophical speculations do really turn on the ideas which underlay Wordsworth's poetical practice. His prose works are one long explanation of all that is involved in that famous distinction between the fancy and the imagination. Of what is understood by both writers as the imaginative quality in the use of poetic figures, we may take some words of Shakespeare as an example. My cousin Suffolk. My soul shall thine keep company to heaven. Tarry, sweet soul, for mine, then fly abreast. The complete infusion here of the figure into the thought, so vividly realized, that, though birds are not actually mentioned, yet the sense of their flight, conveyed to us by the single word abreast, comes to be more than half of the thought itself. This, as the expression of exalted feeling, is an instance of what Coleridge meant by imagination. And this sort of identification of the poet's thought, of himself, with the image or figure which serves him, is the secret, sometimes, of a singularly entire realization of that image, such as makes these lines of Coleridge, for instance, imaginative. Amid the howl of more than wintry storms, the halcyon hears the voice of vernal hours. Already on the wing, There are many such figures both in Coleridge's verse and prose. He has, too, his passages of that sort of impassioned contemplation on the permanent and elementary conditions of nature and humanity, which Wordsworth held to be the essence of a poet, as it would be his proper function to awaken such contemplation in other men, those moments, as Coleridge says, addressing him. Moments awful. Now in thy inner life, and now abroad. When power streamed from thee, and thy soul received the light reflected, as a light bestowed. The entire poem from which these lines are taken, composed on the night after Wordsworth's recitation of a poem on the growth of an individual mind, is, in its high-pitched strain of meditation, and in the combined justice and elevation of its philosophical expression. High and passionate thoughts. To their own music chanted. Wholly sympathetic with the prelude which it celebrates, and of which the subject is, in effect, the generation of the spirit of the lake poetry. The lines to Joseph Cottle have the same philosophically imaginative character, the Ode to Dejection being Coleridge's most sustained effort of this kind. It is in a highly sensitive apprehension of the aspects of external nature that Coleridge identifies himself most closely with one of the main tendencies of the Lake School, a tendency instinctive, and no mere matter of theory, in him as in Wordsworth. That record of the green light, which lingers in the west. And again, of the western sky, and its peculiar tint of yellow-green, which Byron found ludicrously untrue, but which surely needs no defense, is a characteristic example of a singular watchfulness for the minute fact and expression of natural scenery pervading all he wrote, a closeness to the exact physiognomy of nature, having something to do with that idealistic philosophy which sees in the external world no mere concurrence of mechanical agencies, but an animated body, informed and made expressive, like the body of man, by an indwelling intelligence. It was a tendency, doubtless, in the air, for Shelley too is affected by it, and Turner, with the school of landscape which followed him. I had found, Coleridge tells us, that outward forms, the loftiest, still receive their finer influence from the world within. Fair ciphers of vague import, where the eye traces no spot, in which the heart may read history and prophecy. And this induces in him no indifference to actual color and form and process, but such minute realism as this. The thin gray cloud is spread on high. It covers but not hides the sky. The moon is behind and at the full. And yet she looks both small and dull. Or this, which has a touch of romantic weirdness. Naught was green upon the oak, but moss and rarest mistletoe. Or this. There is not wind enough to twirl the one red leaf, the last of its clan, that dances as often as dance it can, hanging so light, and hanging so high, on the topmost twig that looks up at the sky. Or this, with a weirdness, again, like that of some wild French etcher. Lo! The new moon winter bright, and overspread with phantom light. With swimming phantom light o'erspread, but rimmed and circled with a silver thread. I see the old moon in her lap, foretelling the coming on of rain and squally blast. He has a like imaginative apprehension of the silent and unseen processes of nature, its ministries, of dew and frost, for instance, as when he writes, in April, a balmy night. And though the stars be dim, yet let us think upon the vernal showers that gladden the green earth, and we shall find a pleasure in the dimness of the stars. Of such imaginative treatment of landscape there is no better instance than the description of the dell, in Fears in Solitude. A green and silent spot amid the hills. A small and silent dell. O'er stiller place. No singing skylark ever poised himself. But the dell, bathed by the mist, is fresh and delicate, as vernal cornfield, or the unripe flax. When, through its half-transparent stalks, at eve, the level sunshine glimmers with green light. The gust that roared and died away to the distant tree, heard and only heard In this low dell, bowed not the delicate grass. This curious insistence of the mind on one particular spot, till it seems to attain actual expression and a sort of soul in it, a mood so characteristic of the Lake School, occurs in an earnest political poem, written in April, during the alarm of an invasion, and that silent dell is the background against which the tumultuous fears of the poet are in strong relief, while the quiet sense of the place, maintained all through them, gives a true poetic unity to the piece. Good political poetry that shall be permanently moving, can, perhaps, only be written on motives which, for those they concern, have ceased to be open questions, and are really beyond argument, while Coleridge's political poems are for the most part on open questions. For although it was a great part of his intellectual ambition to subject political questions to the action of the fundamental ideas of his philosophy, he was nevertheless an ardent partisan, first on one side, then on the other, of the actual politics proper to the end of the last and the beginning of the present century, where there is still room for much difference of opinion. Yet the destiny of nations, though formless as a whole, and unfinished, presents many traces of his most elevated manner of speculation, cast into that sort of imaginative philosophical expression, in which, in effect, the language itself is inseparable from, or essentially a part of, the thought. France, an ode, begins with a famous apostrophe to liberty. Ye clouds, that far above me float and pause, whose pathless march no mortal may control. Ye ocean waves, that whereso ye roll, yield homage only to eternal laws. Ye woods, that listen to the night birds singing, midway the smooth and perilous slope reclined, save when your own imperious branches swinging, have made a solemn music of the wind, where like a man beloved of God, through glooms which never woodman trod, how oft, pursuing fancies holy, my moonlight way o'er flowering weeds I wound, inspired, beyond the guess of folly, by each rude shape and wild unconquerable sound. O ye loud waves! And O ye forests high! And O ye clouds that far above me soared! Thou rising sun! Thou blue rejoicing sky! Yea, everything that is and will be free, bear witness for me, whereso ye be, with what deep worship I have still adored the spirit of divinest liberty. And the whole ode, though, after Coleridge's way, not quite equal to that exordium, is an example of strong national sentiment, partly in indignant reaction against his own earlier sympathy with the French Republic, inspiring a composition which, in spite of some turgid lines, really justifies itself as poetry, and has that true unity of effect which the ode requires. Liberty, after all his hopes of young France, is only to be found in nature. Thou speedest on thy subtle pinions, the guide of homeless winds, and playmate of the waves. In his changes of political sentiment, Coleridge was associated with the Lake School, and there is yet one other very different sort of sentiment in which he is one with that school, yet all himself, his sympathy, namely, with the animal world. That was a sentiment connected at once with the love of outward nature in himself and in the Lake School, and its assertion of the natural affections in their simplicity, with the homeliness and pity, consequent upon that assertion. The lines to a young ass, tethered, where the close-eaten grass is scarcely seen, while sweet around her waves the tempting green, which had seemed merely whimsical in their day, indicate a vein of interest constant in Coleridge's poems, and at its height in his greatest poems, in Christabel, where it has its effect, as it were antipathetically, in the vivid realization of the serpentine element in Geraldine's nature, and in the Ancient Mariner, whose fate is interwoven with that of the wonderful bird, at whose blessing of the water snakes the curse for the death of the albatross passes away, and where the moral of the love of all creatures, as a sort of religious duty, is definitely expressed. Christabel, though not printed till, was written mainly in the year. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner was printed as a contribution to the lyrical ballads in, and these two poems belong to the great year of Coleridge's poetic production, his 25th year. In poetic quality, above all in that most poetic of all qualities, a keen sense of, and delight in beauty, the infection of which lays hold upon the reader, they are quite out of proportion to all his other compositions. The form in both is that of the ballad, with some of its terminology, and some also of its quaint conceits. They connect themselves with that revival of ballad literature, of which Percy's Relics, and, in another way, Macpherson's Ossian are monuments, and which afterwards so powerfully affected Scott. Young-eyed poesy. All deftly masked as hoar antiquity. The Ancient Mariner, as also, in its measure, Christabel, is a romantic poem, impressing us by bold invention, and appealing to that taste for the supernatural, that longing for le frisson, a shudder, to which the romantic school in Germany, and its derivations in England and France, directly ministered. In Coleridge, personally, this taste had been encouraged by his odd and out-of-the-way reading in the old-fashioned literature of the marvelous, books like Purchas's Pilgrims, early voyages like Hakluyt's, old naturalists and visionary moralists, like Thomas Burnet, from whom he quotes the motto of the Ancient Mariner, facile credo, plures esse naturas invisibiles quam visibles in rerum universitate, etc. Fancies of the strange things which may very well happen, even in broad daylight, to men shut up alone in ships far off on the sea, seem to have occurred to the human mind in all ages with a peculiar readiness, and often have about them, from the story of the stealing of Dionysus downwards, the fascination of a certain dreamy grace, which distinguishes them from other kinds of marvelous inventions. This sort of fascination the Ancient Mariner brings to its highest degree. It is the delicacy, the dreamy grace, in his presentation of the marvelous, which makes Coleridge's work so remarkable. The two palpable intruders from a spiritual world in almost all ghost literature, in Scott and Shakespeare even, have a kind of crudity or coarseness. Coleridge's power is in the very fineness with which, as by some really ghostly finger, he brings home to our inmost sense his inventions, daring as they are, the skeleton ship, the polar spirit, the inspiriting of the dead corpses of the ship's crew. The rhyme of the Ancient Mariner has the plausibility, the perfect adaptation to reason and the general aspect of life, which belongs to the marvelous, when actually presented as part of a credible experience in our dreams. Doubtless, the mere experience of the opium eater, the habit he must almost necessarily fall into of noting the more elusive phenomena of dreams, had something to do with that. In its essence, however, it is connected with a more purely intellectual circumstance in the development of Coleridge's poetic gift. Someone once asked William Blake, to whom Coleridge has many resemblances, when either is at his best, that whole episode of the re-inspiriting of the ship's crew in the Ancient Mariner being comparable to Blake's well-known design of the morning stars singing together, whether he had ever seen a ghost, and was surprised when the famous seer, who ought, one might think, to have seen so many, answered frankly, only once. His spirits, at once more delicate, and so much more real, than any ghost, the burden, as they were the privilege, of his temperament, like it, were an integral element in his everyday life. And the difference of mood expressed in that question and its answer, is indicative of a change of temper in regard to the supernatural which has passed over the whole modern mind, and of which the true measure is the influence of the writings of Swedenborg. What that change is we may see if we compare the vision by which Swedenborg was called, as he thought, to his work, with the ghost which called Hamlet, or the spells of Marlowe's Faust with those of Goethe's. The modern mind, so minutely self-scrutinizing, if it is to be affected at all by a sense of the supernatural, needs to be more finely touched than was possible in the older, romantic presentment of it. The spectral object, so crude, so impossible, has become plausible, as the blot upon the brain. That will show itself without. And is understood to be but a condition of one's own mind, for which, according to the skepticism, latent at least, in so much of our modern philosophy, the so-called real things themselves are but spectra after all. It is this finer, more delicately marvelous supernaturalism, fruit of his more delicate psychology, that Coleridge infuses into romantic adventure, itself also then a new or revived thing in English literature, and with a fineness of weird effect in the Ancient Mariner, unknown in those older, more simple, romantic legends and ballads. It is a flower of medieval or later German romance, growing up in the peculiarly compounded atmosphere of modern psychological speculation, and putting forth in it wholly new qualities. The quaint prose commentary, which runs side by side with the verse of the Ancient Mariner, illustrates this, a composition of quite a different shade of beauty and merit from that of the verse which it accompanies, connecting this, the chief poem of Coleridge, with his philosophy, and emphasizing therein that psychological interest of which I have spoken, its curious soul lore. Completeness, the perfectly rounded wholeness and unity of the impression it leaves on the mind of a reader who fairly gives himself to it, that, too, is one of the characteristics of a really excellent work, in the poetic as in every other kind of art, and by this completeness, the Ancient Mariner certainly gains upon Christabel, a completeness, entire as that of Wordsworth's Leech Gatherer, or Keats's St. Agnes Eve, each typical in its way of such wholeness or entirety of effect on a careful reader. It is Coleridge's one great complete work, the one really finished thing, in a life of many beginnings. Christabel remained a fragment. In the Ancient Mariner this unity is secured in part by the skill with which the incidents of the marriage feast are made to break in dreamily from time to time upon the main story. And then, how pleasantly, how reassuringly, the whole nightmare story itself is made to end, among the clear fresh sounds and lights of the bay, where it began, with the moonlight steeped in silentness. The steady weathercock. So different from the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner in regard to this completeness of effect, Christabel illustrates the same complexion of motives, a like intellectual situation. Here, too, the work is of a kind peculiar to one who touches the characteristic motives of the old romantic ballad, with a spirit made subtle and fine by modern reflection, as we feel, I think, in such passages as "But though my slumber had gone by, this dream it would not pass away. It seems to live upon mine eye. And for she, belike, hath drunken deep of all the blessedness of sleep." And again, "With such perplexity of mind as dreams too lively leave behind." And that gift of handling the finer passages of human feeling, at once with power and delicacy, which was another result of his finer psychology, of his exquisitely refined habit of self-reflection, is illustrated by a passage on friendship in the second part. Alas! They had been friends in youth. But whispering tongues can poison truth. And constancy lives in realms above. And life is thorny, and youth is vain. And to be wroth with one we love doth work like madness in the brain. And thus it chanced, as I divine, with Roland and Sir Leoline. Each spake words of high disdain, and insult to his heart's best brother. They parted, ne'er to meet again. But never either found another to free the hollow heart from paining. They stood aloof, the scars remaining, like cliffs which had been rent asunder. A dreary sea now flows between, but neither heat, nor frost, nor thunder shall wholly do away, I ween, the marks of that which once hath been. I suppose these lines leave almost every reader with a quickened sense of the beauty and compass of human feeling, and it is the sense of such richness and beauty which, in spite of his dejection, in spite of that burden of his morbid lassitude, accompanies Coleridge himself through life. A warm poetic joy in everything beautiful, whether it be a moral sentiment, like the friendship of Roland and Leoline, or only the flakes of falling light from the water snakes, this joy, visiting him, now and again, after sickly dreams, in sleep or waking, as a relief not to be forgotten, and with such a power of felicitous expression that the infection of it passes irresistibly to the reader. Such is the predominant element in the matter of his poetry, as cadence is the predominant quality of its form. We bless thee for our creation, he might have said, in his later period of definite religious assent, because the world is so beautiful, the world of ideas, living spirits, detached from the divine nature itself, to inform and lift the heavy mass of material things, the world of man, above all in his melodious and intelligible speech, the world of living creatures and natural scenery, the world of dreams. What he really did say, by way of a tombless epitaph, is true enough of himself. Sickness, 'tis true. Whole years of weary days, besieged him close, even to the gates and inlets of his life. But it is true, no less, that strenuous, firm. And with a natural gladness, he maintained the citadel unconquered, and in joy was strong to follow the delightful muse. For not a hidden path, that to the shades of the beloved Parnassian forest leads, lurked undiscovered by him, not a rill there issues from the fount of Hippocrene, but he had traced it upward to its source. Through open glade, dark glen, and secret dell, knew the gay wild flowers on its banks, and culled its medicinaable herbs. Yea, oft alone, piercing the long-neglected holy cave, the haunt obscure of old philosophy, he bade with lifted torch its starry walls sparkle, as erst they sparkled to the flame of odorous lamps tended by saint and sage. O framed for calmer times and nobler hearts! O studious poet, eloquent for truth! Philosopher, contemning wealth and death, yet docile, childlike, full of life and love. The student of empirical science asks, are absolute principles attainable? What are the limits of knowledge? The answer he receives from science itself is not ambiguous. What the moralist asks is, shall we gain or lose by surrendering human life to the relative spirit? Experience answers that the dominant tendency of life is to turn ascertained truth into a dead letter, to make us all the phlegmatic servants of routine. The relative spirit, by its constant dwelling on the more fugitive conditions or circumstances of things, breaking through 1,000 rough and brutal classifications, and giving elasticity to inflexible principles, begets an intellectual finesse of which the ethical result is a delicate and tender justice in the criticism of human life. Who would gain more than Coleridge by criticism in such a spirit? We know how his life has appeared when judged by absolute standards. We see him trying to apprehend the absolute, to stereotype forms of faith and philosophy, to attain, as he says, fixed principles, in politics, morals, and religion, to fix one mode of life as the essence of life, refusing to see the parts as parts only, and all the time his own pathetic history pleads for a more elastic moral philosophy than his, and cries out against every formula less living and flexible than life itself. From his childhood he hungered for eternity. There, after all, is the incontestable claim of Coleridge. The perfect flower of any elementary type of life must always be precious to humanity, and Coleridge is a true flower of the ennuyé, of the type of René. More than Childe Harold, more than Werther, more than René himself, Coleridge, by what he did, what he was, and what he failed to do, represents that inexhaustible discontent, languor, and homesickness, that endless regret, the chords of which ring all through our modern literature. It is to the romantic element in literature that those qualities belong. One day, perhaps, we may come to forget the distant horizon, with full knowledge of the situation, to be content with what is here and now, and herein is the essence of classical feeling. But by us of the present moment, certainly, by us for whom the Greek spirit, with its engaging naturalness, simple, chastened, debonair, Triphes, Habertitos, Clydes, Coretin, Himeru, Pot-ho pater, of daintiness, delicacy, luxury, graces, father of desire, is itself the sangreal of an endless pilgrimage. Coleridge, with his passion for the absolute, for something fixed where all is moving, his faintness, his broken memory, his intellectual disquiet, may still be ranked among the interpreters of one of the constituent elements of our life. Essay on Charles Lamb. Those English critics who at the beginning of the present century introduced from Germany, together with some other subtleties of thought transplanted hither not without advantage, the distinction between the fancy and the imagination, made much also of the cognate distinction between wit and humor, between that unreal and transitory mirth, which is as the crackling of thorns under the pot, and the laughter which blends with tears and even with the sublimities of the imagination, and which, in its most exquisite motives, is one with pity, the laughter of the comedies of Shakespeare, hardly less expressive than his moods of seriousness or solemnity, of that deeply stirred soul of sympathy in him, as flowing from which both tears and laughter are alike genuine and contagious. This distinction between wit and humor, Coleridge and other kindred critics applied, with much effect, in their studies of some of our older English writers. And as the distinction between imagination and fancy, made popular by Wordsworth, found its best justification in certain essential differences of stuff in Wordsworth's own writings, so this other critical distinction, between wit and humor, finds a sort of visible interpretation and instance in the character and writings of Charles Lamb, one who lived more consistently than most writers among subtle literary theories, and whose remains are still full of curious interest for the student of literature as a fine art. The author of the English humorists of the 18th century, coming to the humorists of the 19th, would have found, as is true preeminently of Thackeray himself, the springs of pity in them deepened by the deeper subjectivity, the intenser and closer living with itself, which is characteristic of the temper of the later generation, and therewith, the mirth also, from the amalgam of which with pity humor proceeds, has become, in Charles Dickens, for example, freer and more boisterous. To this more high-pitched feeling, since predominant in our literature, the writings of Charles Lamb, whose life occupies the last quarter of the 18th century in the first quarter of the 19th, are a transition, and such union of grave, of terrible even, with gay, we may note in the circumstances of his life, as reflected thence into his work. We catch the aroma of a singular, homely sweetness about his first years, spent on Thames side, amid the red bricks and terraced gardens, with their rich historical memories of old-fashioned legal London. Just above the poorer class, deprived, as he says, of the sweet food of academic institution, he is fortunate enough to be reared in the classical languages at an ancient school, where he becomes the companion of Coleridge, as at a later period he was his enthusiastic disciple. So far, the years go by with less than the usual share of boyish difficulties, protected, one fancies, seeing what he was afterwards, by some attraction of temper in the quaint child, small and delicate, with a certain Jewish expression in his clear, brown complexion, eyes not precisely of the same color, and a slow walk adding to the staidness of his figure, and whose infirmity of speech, increased by agitation, is partly engaging. And the cheerfulness of all this, of the mere aspect of Lamb's quiet subsequent life also, might make the more superficial reader think of him as in himself something slight, and of his mirth as cheaply bought. Yet we know that beneath this blithe surface there was something of the fateful domestic horror, of the beautiful heroism and devotedness too, of old Greek tragedy. His sister Mary, 10 years his senior, in a sudden paroxysm of madness, caused the death of her mother, and was brought to trial for what an overstrained justice might have construed as the greatest of crimes. She was released on the brother's pledging himself to watch over her, and to this sister, from the age of 21, Charles Lamb sacrificed himself, seeking thenceforth, says his earliest biographer, no connection which could interfere with her supremacy in his affections, or impair his ability to sustain and comfort her. The feverish, romantic tie of love, he cast away in exchange for the charities of home. Only, from time to time, the madness returned, affecting him too, once, and we see the brother and sister voluntarily yielding to restraint. In estimating the humor of Elia, we must no more forget the strong undercurrent of this great misfortune and pity, than one could forget it in his actual story. So he becomes the best critic, almost the discoverer, of Webster, a dramatist of genius so somber, so heavily colored, so macabre. Rosamund Gray, written in his 23rd year, a story with something bitter and exaggerated, an almost insane fixedness of gloom perceptible in it, strikes clearly this note in his work. For himself, and from his own point of view, the exercise of his gift, of his literary art, came to gild or sweeten a life of monotonous labor, and seemed, as far as regarded others, no very important thing, availing to give them a little pleasure, and inform them a little, chiefly in a retrospective manner, but in no way concerned with the turning of the tides of the great world. And yet this very modesty, this unambitious way of conceiving his work, has impressed upon it a certain exceptional enduringness. For of the remarkable English writers contemporary with Lamb, many were greatly preoccupied with ideas of practice, religious, moral, political, ideas which have since, in some sense or other, entered permanently into the general consciousness, and, these having no longer any stimulus for a generation provided with a different stock of ideas, the writings of those who spent so much of themselves in their propagation have lost, with posterity, something of what they gained by them in immediate influence. Coleridge, Wordsworth, Shelley even, sharing so largely in the unrest of their own age, and made personally more interesting thereby, yet, of their actual work, surrender more to the mere course of time than some of those who may have seemed to exercise themselves hardly at all in great matters, to have been little serious, or a little indifferent, regarding them. Of this number of the disinterested servants of literature, smaller in England than in France, Charles Lamb is one. In the making of prose he realizes the principle of art for its own sake, as completely as Keats in the making of verse. And, working ever close to the concrete, to the details, great or small, of actual things, books, persons, and with no part of them blurred to his vision by the intervention of mere abstract theories, he has reached an enduring moral effect also, in a sort of boundless sympathy. Unoccupied, as he might seem, with great matters, he is in immediate contact with what is real, especially in its caressing littleness, that littleness in which there is much of the whole woeful heart of things, and meets it more than halfway with a perfect understanding of it. What sudden, unexpected touches of pathos in him, bearing witness how the sorrow of humanity, the Weltschmerz, the constant aching of its wounds, is ever present with him, but what a gift also for the enjoyment of life in its subtleties, of enjoyment actually refined by the need of some thoughtful economies and making the most of things. Little arts of happiness he is ready to teach to others. The quaint remarks of children which another would scarcely have heard, he preserves, little flies in the priceless amber of his Attic wit, and has his praise of chimney sweepers, as William Blake has written, with so much natural pathos, the chimney sweeper's song, valuing carefully their white teeth, and fine enjoyment of white sheets in stolen sleep at Arundel Castle, as he tells the story, anticipating something of the mood of our deep humorists of the last generation. His simple mother-pity for those who suffer by accident, or unkindness of nature, blindness for instance, or fateful disease of mind like his sister's, has something primitive in its largeness, and on behalf of ill-used animals he is early in composing a pity's gift. And if, in deeper or more superficial sense, the dead do care at all for their name and fame, then how must the souls of Shakespeare and Webster have been stirred, after so long converse with things that stopped their ears, whether above or below the soil, at his exquisite appreciations of them, the souls of Titian and of Hogarth too, for, what has not been observed so generally as the excellence of his literary criticism, Charles Lamb is a fine critic of painting also. It was as loyal, self-forgetful work for others, for Shakespeare's self first, for instance, and then for Shakespeare's readers, that too was done. He has the true scholar's way of forgetting himself in his subject. For though defrauded, as we saw, in his young years, of the sweet food of academic institution, he is yet essentially a scholar, and all his work mainly retrospective, as I said, his own sorrows, affections, perceptions, being alone real to him of the present. I cannot make these present times, he says once, present to me. Above all, he becomes not merely an expositor, permanently valuable, but for Englishmen almost the discoverer of the Old English drama. The book is such as I am glad there should be, he modestly says of the specimens of English dramatic poets who lived about the time of Shakespeare, to which, however, he adds in a series of notes the very quintessence of criticism, the choicest savour and perfume of Elizabethan poetry being sorted, and stored here, with a sort of delicate intellectual Epicureanism, which has had the effect of winning for these, then almost forgotten, poets, one generation after another of enthusiastic students. Could he but have known how fresh a source of culture he was evoking there for other generations, through all those years in which, a little wistfully, he would harp on the limitation of his time by business, and sigh for a better fortune in regard to literary opportunities. To feel strongly the charm of an old poet or moralist, the literary charm of Burton, for instance, or Quarles, or the Duchess of Newcastle, and then to interpret that charm, to convey it to others, he seeming to himself but to hand on to others, in mere humble ministration, that of which for them he is really the creator, this is the way of his criticism, cast off in a stray letter often, or passing note, or lightest essay or conversation. It is in such a letter, for instance, that we come upon a singularly penetrative estimate of the genius and writings of Defoe. Tracking, with an attention always alert, the whole process of their production to its starting point in the deep places of the mind, he seems to realize the but half-conscious intuitions of Hogarth or Shakespeare, and develops the great ruling unities which have swayed their actual work, or puts up, and takes, the one morsel of good stuff in an old, forgotten writer. Even in what he says casually there comes an aroma of Old English, noticeable echoes, in chance turn and phrase, of the great masters of style, the old masters. Godwin, seeing in quotation a passage from John Woodville, takes it for a choice fragment of an old dramatist, and goes to Lamb to assist him in finding the author. His power of delicate imitation in prose and verse reaches the length of a fine mimicry even, as in those last essays of Elia on popular fallacies, with their gentle reproduction or caricature of Sir Thomas Browne, showing, the more completely, his mastery, by disinterested study, of those elements of the man which were the real source of style in that great, solemn master of Old English, who, ready to say what he has to say with fearless homeliness, yet continually overawes one with touches of a strange utterance from worlds afar. For it is with the delicacies of fine literature especially, its gradations of expression, its fine judgment, its pure sense of words, of vocabulary, things, alas, dying out in the English literature of the present, together with the appreciation of them in our literature of the past, that his literary mission is chiefly concerned. And yet, delicate, refining, daintily Epicurean, as he may seem, when he writes of giants, such as Hogarth or Shakespeare, though often but in a stray note, you catch the sense of veneration with which those great names in past literature and art brooded over his intelligence, his undiminished impressibility by the great effects in them. Reading, commenting on Shakespeare, he is like a man who walks alone under a grand stormy sky, and among unwonted tricks of light, when powerful spirits might seem to be abroad upon the air, and the grim humor of Hogarth, as he analyses it, rises into a kind of spectral grotesque, while he too knows the secret of fine, significant touches like theirs. There are traits, customs, characteristics of houses and dress, surviving morsels of old life, such as Hogarth has transferred so vividly into the Rake's Progress, or Marriage à la mode, concerning which we well understand how, common, uninteresting, or even worthless in themselves, they have come to please us at last as things picturesque, being set in relief against the modes of our different age. Customs, stiff to us, stiff dresses, stiff furniture, types of cast-off fashions, left by accident, and which no one ever meant to preserve, we contemplate with more than good nature, as having in them the veritable accent of a time, not altogether to be replaced by its more solemn and self-conscious deposits, like those tricks of individuality which we find quite tolerable in persons, because they convey to us the secret of lifelike expression, and with regard to which we are all to some extent humorists. But it is part of the privilege of the genuine humorist to anticipate this pensive mood with regard to the ways and things of his own day, to look upon the tricks in manner of the life about him with that same refined, purged sort of vision, which will come naturally to those of a later generation, in observing whatever may have survived by chance of its mere external habit. Seeing things always by the light of an understanding more entire than is possible for ordinary minds, of the whole mechanism of humanity, and seeing also the manner, the outward mode or fashion, always in strict connection with the spiritual condition which determined it, a humorist such as Charles Lamb anticipates the enchantment of distance, and the characteristics of places, ranks, habits of life, are transfigured for him, even now and in advance of time, by poetic light, justifying what some might condemn as mere sentimentality, in the effort to hand on unbroken the tradition of such fashion or accent. The praise of beggars, the cries of London, the traits of actors just grown old, the spots in town where the country, its fresh green and fresh water, still lingered on, one after another, amidst the bustle, the quaint, dimmed, just played out farces, he had relished so much, coming partly through them to understand the earlier English theatre as a thing once really alive, those fountains and sundials of old gardens, of which he entertains such dainty discourse, he feels the poetry of these things, as the poetry of things old indeed, but surviving as an actual part of the life of the present, and as something quite different from the poetry of things flatly gone from us and antique, which come back to us, if at all, as entire strangers, like Scott's old Scotch border personages, their oaths and armour. Such gift of appreciation depends, as I said, on the habitual apprehension of men's life as a whole, its organic wholeness, as extending even to the least things in it, of its outward manner in connection with its inward temper, and it involves a fine perception of the congruities, the musical accordance between humanity and its environment of custom, society, personal intercourse, as if all this, with its meetings, partings, ceremonies, gesture, tones of speech, were some delicate instrument on which an expert performer is playing. These are some of the characteristics of Elia, one essentially an essayist, and of the true family of Montaigne, never judging, as he says, system-wise of things, but fastening on particulars, saying all things as it were on chance occasion only, and by way of pastime, yet succeeding thus, glimpse-wise, in catching and recording more frequently than others, the gayest, happiest attitude of things. A casual writer for dreamy readers, yet always giving the reader so much more than he seemed to propose. There is something of the follower of George Fox about him, and the Quaker's belief in the inward light coming to one passive, to the mere wayfarer, who will be sure at all events to lose no light which falls by the way, glimpses, suggestions, delightful half-apprehensions, profound thoughts of old philosophers, hints of the innermost reason in things, the full knowledge of which is held in reserve, all the varied stuff, that is, of which genuine essays are made. And with him, as with Montaigne, the desire of self-portraiture is, below all more superficial tendencies, the real motive in writing at all, a desire closely connected with that intimacy, that modern subjectivity, which may be called the Montainesque element in literature. What he designs is to give you himself, to acquaint you with his likeness, but must do this, if at all, indirectly, being indeed always more or less reserved, for himself and his friends, friendship counting for so much in his life, that he is jealous of anything that might jar or disturb it, even to the length of a sort of insincerity, to which he assigns its quaint praise. This lover of stage plays significantly welcoming a little touch of the artificiality of play to sweeten the intercourse of actual life. And, in effect, a very delicate and expressive portrait of him does put itself together for the duly meditative reader. In indirect touches of his own work, scraps of faded old letters, what others remembered of his talk, the man's likeness emerges, what he laughed and wept at, his sudden elevations, and longings after absent friends, his fine casuistries of affection and devices to jog sometimes, as he says, the lazy happiness of perfect love, his solemn moments of higher discourse with the young, as they came across him on occasion, and went along a little way with him, the sudden, surprised apprehension of beauties in old literature, revealing anew the deep soul of poetry in things, and with all the pure spirit of fun, having its way again, laughter, that most short-lived of all things, some of Shakespeare's even being grown hollow, wearing well with him. Much of all this comes out through his letters, which may be regarded as a department of his essays. He is an old-fashioned letter-writer, the essence of the old fashion of letter-writing lying, as with true essay-writing, in the dexterous availing oneself of accident and circumstance, in the prosecution of deeper lines of observation, although, just as with the record of his conversation, one loses something, in losing the actual tones of the stammerer, still graceful in his halting, as he halted also in composition, composing slowly and by fits, like a Flemish painter, as he tells us, so. It is to be regretted, says the editor of his letters, that in the printed letters the reader will lose the curious varieties of writing with which the originals abound, and which are scrupulously adapted to the subject. Also, he was a true collector, delighting in the personal finding of a thing, in the color an old book or print gets for him by the little accidents which attest previous ownership. Wither's Emblems, that old book and quaint, long desired, when he finds it at last, he values none the less because a child had colored the plates with his paints. A lover of household warmth everywhere, of that tempered atmosphere which our various habitations get by men's living within them, he sticks to his favorite books as he did to his friends, and loved the town, with a jealous eye for all its characteristics, old houses, coming to have souls for him. The yearning for mere warmth against him in another, makes him content, all through life, with pure brotherliness, the most kindly and natural species of love, as he says, in place of the passion of love. Brother and sister, sitting thus side by side, have, of course, their anticipations how one of them must sit at last in the faint sun alone, and set us speculating, as we read, as to precisely what amount of melancholy really accompanied for him the approach of old age, so steadily foreseen, make us note also, with pleasure, his successive wakings up to cheerful realities, out of a too curious musing over what is gone and what remains, of life. In his subtle capacity for enjoying the more refined points of earth, of human relationship, he could throw the gleam of poetry or humor on what seemed common or threadbare, has a care for the sighs, and the weary, humdrum preoccupations of very weak people, down to their little pathetic gentilities, even, while, in the purely human temper, he can write of death, almost like Shakespeare. And that care, through all his enthusiasm of discovery, for what is accustomed, in literature, connected thus with his close clinging to home and the earth, was congruous also with that love for the accustomed in religion, which we may notice in him. He is one of the last votaries of that old-world sentiment, based on the feelings of hope and awe, which may be described as the religion of men of letters, as Sir Thomas Browne has his religion of the physician, religion as understood by the soberer men of letters in the last century, Addison, Gray, and Johnson, by Jane Austen and Thackeray, later. A high way of feeling developed largely by constant intercourse with the great things of literature, and extended in its turn to those matters greater still, this religion lives, in the main retrospectively, in a system of received sentiments and beliefs, received, like those great things of literature and art, in the first instance, on the authority of a long tradition, in the course of which they have linked themselves in 1,000 complex ways to the conditions of human life, and no more question now than the feeling one keeps by one of the greatness, say, of Shakespeare. For Charles Lamb, such form of religion becomes the solemn background on which the nearer and more exciting objects of his immediate experience relieve themselves, borrowing from it an expression of calm, its necessary atmosphere being indeed a profound quiet, that quiet which has in it a kind of sacramental efficacy, working, we might say, on the principle of the opus operatum, almost without any cooperation of one's own, towards the assertion of the higher self. And, in truth, to men of Lamb's delicately attuned temperament mere physical stillness has its full value, such natures seeming to long for it sometimes, as for no merely negative thing, with a sort of mystical sensuality. The writings of Charles Lamb are an excellent illustration of the value of reserve in literature. Below his quiet, his quaintness, his humor, and what may seem the slightness, the occasional or accidental character of his work, there lies, as I said at starting, as in his life, a genuinely tragic element. The gloom, reflected at its darkest in those hard shadows of Rosamund Gray, is always there, though not always realized either for himself or his readers, and restrained always in utterance. It gives to those lighter matters on the surface of life and literature among which he for the most part moved, a wonderful force of expression, as if at any moment these slight words and fancies might pierce very far into the deeper soul of things. In his writing, as in his life, that quiet is not the low flying of one from the first drowsy by choice, and needing the prick of some strong passion or worldly ambition, to stimulate him into all the energy of which he is capable, but rather the reaction of nature, after an escape from fate, dark and insane as in old Greek tragedy, following upon which the sense of mere relief becomes a kind of passion, as with one who, having narrowly escaped earthquake or shipwreck, finds a thing for grateful tears in just sitting quiet at home, under the wall, till the end of days. He felt the genius of places, and I sometimes think he resembles the places he knew and liked best, and where his lot fell, London, 65 years ago, with Covent Garden in the old theatres, and the Temple Gardens still unspoiled, Thames gliding down, and beyond to north and south the fields at Enfield or Hampton, to which, with their living trees, the thoughts wander, from the hardwood of the desk, fields fresher, and coming nearer to town than, but in one of which the present writer remembers, on a brooding early summer's day, to have heard the cuckoo for the first time. Here, the surface of things is certainly humdrum, the streets dingy, the green places, where the child goes a-maying, tame enough. But nowhere are things more apt to respond to the brighter weather, nowhere is there so much difference between rain and sunshine, nowhere do the clouds roll together more grandly, those quaint suburban pastorals gathering a certain quality of grandeur from the background of the great city, with its weighty atmosphere, and portent of storm in the rapid light on dome and bleached stone steeples. End of selected essays.